Beneath the quiet hum of the cockpit, across endless skies and shifting cloudscapes, aircraft have disappeared, leaving only fragments of their final communications behind. These unsettling transmissions, recorded in the tense rhythm of pilots' voices and instruments' readings, offer glimpses of confusion, mechanical failure, or inexplicable anomalies that precede sudden silence. From the icy expanse of the South Pacific to the turbulent corridors above the Atlantic, each flight carries its own enigmatic story. Cryptic warnings, distorted instrument reports, and decisions made in the fragile balance between human skill and unseen forces. As these narratives unfold, we trace the courses of vanished planes, uncover the precise conditions that led to their final moments, and confront the silent testimony left in their recorded signals, revealing mysteries that linger long after the aircraft themselves have vanished. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. The Boeing 777 lifted into the humid night from Kuala Lumpur just after midnight, carrying 239 people toward Beijing on what appeared to be an uneventful overnight flight. The aircraft, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, had departed on March 8, 2014, under clear weather conditions, its route carefully plotted across the South China Sea. Inside the cockpit, procedures unfolded exactly as they had countless times before, while air traffic controllers monitored the aircraft's steady climb. Nothing in the early moments suggested that this flight would soon be defined not by where it arrived, but by the unsettling final transmissions it left behind. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, routine communications passed between the pilots and Malaysian air traffic control, each exchange precise and professional. Radar data showed the plane maintaining a stable course along Airway L642, its transponder transmitting identification and altitude as expected. At 1:19 a.m. local time, controllers instructed the crew to contact the next control sector as the aircraft approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. The response came moments later, delivered calmly and without hesitation, using words so ordinary they would later take on an unsettling weight. "Good night, Malaysian 370, the voice said, acknowledging the handoff and closing the exchange. It was a standard phrase spoken countless times by pilots around the world, signalling nothing more than a routine transition between airspace authorities. Seconds after that transmission, the aircraft's transponder stopped sending data. On civilian radar screens, the plane simply disappeared, leaving controllers with no immediate explanation and no indication of distress. The final message, serene and unremarkable, would become one of the most analysed sentences in aviation history. Unknown to air traffic control at the time, military radar installations continued to track an unidentified aircraft as it deviated sharply from its planned route. The blip turned westward, crossing back over the Malay Peninsula before heading northwest toward the Andaman Sea. This manoeuvre suggested deliberate input into the flight management system rather than a sudden mechanical failure. Yet no further radio calls were made, no emergency codes were transmitted, and no mayday was issued. The aircraft moved silently through controlled airspace, its presence known only through intermittent military radar returns. Before the final radio transmission was ever dissected, another system aboard the aircraft had already gone quiet. The Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, known as ACARS, stopped transmitting data roughly 30 minutes into the flight, ceasing automated messages about engine performance and aircraft health. ACARS failures can occur during power loss, yet the aircraft continued flying for hours afterward, suggesting the system was disabled rather than destroyed. Investigators noted that ACARS was manually switchable from the cockpit, a detail that complicated efforts to frame the event as a sudden emergency. Its silence preceded the transponder's disappearance, forming a layered withdrawal from surveillance rather than a single catastrophic break. Inside the cockpit, whatever unfolded during those hours left no immediate trace for investigators to hear or see. The cockpit voice recorder, which could have preserved the sounds and conversations of the flight's final moments, was never recovered. Without it, the calm tone of the last transmission stands in stark contrast to the complexity of the aircraft's subsequent movements. The absence of any audible alarm or distress call deepened the mystery, suggesting a situation that did not unfold suddenly, but instead evolved in silence, hidden behind closed cockpit doors. Satellite communication data later revealed that the aircraft remained airborne for several hours after it vanished from radar. Automated handshake signals between the plane and an Inmarsat satellite continued until shortly after 8 a.m, indicating that the aircraft had flown far beyond its intended destination. Analysis of these signals pointed investigators toward two vast corridors, one stretching north into Central Asia, the other south across the Indian Ocean. Each arc represented a range of possible paths, traced not by human communication, but by the quiet mechanical persistence of onboard systems. As search efforts intensified, the southern corridor emerged as the most likely route, leading into one of the most remote expanses on Earth. The Indian Ocean offered few visual references, no radar coverage, and immense depths that complicated underwater searches. Despite multinational efforts involving ships, aircraft, and autonomous underwater vehicles, no main wreckage was ever conclusively located. Debris confirmed to be from the aircraft began washing ashore months later along the coasts of the western Indian Ocean, offering proof of loss without clarity of cause. The unsettling nature of the final transmission lies not in what was said, but in what was never communicated afterward. There were no signs of confusion in the voice, no hesitation, no coded warning embedded in the words. Investigators examined the phrasing closely, debating whether subtle anomalies existed in tone or timing, yet nothing conclusively pointed to distress. The message adhered perfectly to protocol, making it impossible to distinguish from thousands of other routine sign-offs exchanged daily across global airspace. Various theories emerged over the years, ranging from catastrophic mechanical failure to deliberate human action, each attempting to reconcile the aircraft's controlled maneuvers with its total disappearance. Official investigations carefully avoided speculation without evidence, emphasizing that the sequence of events remained incomplete. What remained undeniable was that Flight 370 did not behave like an aircraft experiencing sudden failure. Its path suggested intentional changes, executed calmly and methodically, without triggering alarms or radio calls that might have explained its fate. The silence that followed the final transmission became as significant as the words themselves. For hours, the aircraft flew beyond the reach of radar and radio, guided by systems designed to function without human intervention. When the satellite handshakes finally ceased, they did so without explanation, leaving behind only mathematical arcs and probabilities. The transition from routine communication to total absence occurred without drama, unfolding quietly in the darkness over open water. In the years since, Flight 370 has come to symbolize the limits of modern aviation surveillance and the enduring vulnerability of aircraft beyond radar coverage. Despite advanced navigation systems and constant communication protocols, a wide-body jet was able to vanish with no confirmed wreckage site and no verified cause. The final words spoken from its cockpit remained suspended in time, a calm farewell delivered before the aircraft slipped into a void where certainty no longer applies. Long after the radar screens went blank and the searchers fell silent, the simple phrase spoken at 1:19 a.m. continues to echo, marking the precise moment when a routine flight crossed into unresolved absence. Air France, Flight 447. High above the equatorial Atlantic, the night offered no horizon, only layered cloud and invisible turbulence surrounding Air France. Flight 447 as it moved steadily through darkness. The Airbus A330 had departed Rio de Janeiro for Paris on June 1, 2009, entering a region where towering thunderstorms formed with little warning, and radar coverage from land-based stations disappeared entirely. Inside the aircraft, the cruise flight continued under automated control, the engines producing steady thrust while systems monitored altitude, speed, and configuration, simultaneously transmitting routine maintenance data to ground stations. The flight passed over the ocean in near total isolation, and within these hours, the aircraft's final transmissions would become a haunting record of technological vigilance confronting human limits. Subtle inconsistencies began appearing on the flight displays, not as alarms, but as small numerical disagreements that quietly challenged the aircraft's understanding of its own speed. Ice crystals at high altitude had begun obstructing the pitot tubes, the sensors responsible for measuring airspeed, causing inconsistent readings across the primary flight displays. For the crew, these anomalies were not immediately alarming, but they introduced a persistent uncertainty. Small differences in indicated airspeed multiplied into a complex scenario, forcing pilots to reconcile data that seemed plausible but was, in fact, unreliable. The aircraft continued forward, unaware that these minor discrepancies would soon trigger a chain of alarms and automated responses that no human could easily interpret. Without warning, the cockpit filled with the neutral tones of automated alerts, each message precise in language yet increasingly difficult to interpret in context. When the flight computers detected the unreliable airspeed, the autopilot disengaged automatically, handing control to the pilots in an environment of darkness, turbulence, and minimal visual reference. Stall warnings sounded intermittently, triggered by calculations derived from the now compromised speed measurements. Meanwhile, the aircraft's automated systems continue to transmit data to ground stations, as if documenting events in real time without regard for the human capacity to respond. Each new alarm added tension without providing clarity, a mechanical voice narrating uncertainty that could not be resolved in the moment. Short exchanges between the pilots reflected growing uncertainty, their words clipped and technical as they attempted to reconcile instruments that no longer agreed. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed rapid questions about speed, attitude, and system behavior, each question seeking confirmation in fragmented bits of information. Pilots referenced fluctuating displays, interspersed with repeated alarms as they attempted to create coherence from conflicting data. Every verbal exchange was brief and matter-of-fact, yet collectively they portrayed a crew confronting a situation that resisted interpretation. Meaning itself became fractured. Even the most familiar procedures failed to stabilize the unfolding scenario, and human judgment collided with the limitations of both instruments and environment. When the autopilot disengaged, control shifted abruptly from program stability to human judgment inside a violently unstable air mass. Manual control inputs caused the aircraft's nose to rise, pushing it into thinner air at altitudes where lift margins narrowed dangerously. Every corrective action, guided by incomplete information, inadvertently compounded instability. The engines continued producing thrust, yet their power could not counteract the aerodynamic limitations the aircraft had entered. The combination of turbulence, unreliable airspeed readings, and delayed corrective input created a prolonged stall condition, a scenario both invisible to outside observers and impossible to fully comprehend from inside the cockpit. Even as the situation deteriorated, the aircraft continued transmitting streams of data, sending altitude, configuration changes, and system statuses to distant ground receivers. These automated messages recorded control law changes, repeated warnings, and system faults with clinical accuracy. Each message preserved a snapshot of the aircraft's state, yet none provided interpretive guidance. Ground teams could only observe the information without affecting outcomes, leaving a digital trail that simultaneously informed and frustrated investigators. In this way, the plane's own systems became a witness to its descent, creating a paradox of transparency. The more the aircraft spoke, the less humanity could act on its knowledge. The aircraft's nose rose unexpectedly, carrying it into thinner air where aerodynamic margins narrowed and recovery became increasingly uncertain. Angle of attack increased while airspeed readings remained unreliable, producing a classic aerodynamic stall. Though the engines maintained thrust, the aircraft could not regain lift without accurate information and appropriate corrective input. Pilots worked to stabilize the climb and prevent further loss, yet the combination of turbulence, instrument disagreement, and human reaction led to oscillations that neither manual control nor automated systems could fully counter. The descent was gradual yet inexorable, with the aircraft trapped in a high-altitude stall over open water, each second measured precisely by systems and yet invisible to the world below. A sequence of automated maintenance messages marked the aircraft's final minutes, recording system states with unemotional accuracy as warnings repeated relentlessly. These included stall warnings, flight law transitions, and configuration changes, all time stamped to within seconds of one another. The messages continued to flow even after the autopilot disengaged and human control became erratic, forming a continuous digital record of unfolding failure. No distress call accompanied these transmissions, leaving investigators with only system-generated signals to interpret. The aircraft communicated almost until impact, producing a chilling log of mechanical reasoning amid human uncertainty, a voice insisting on data even when control had slipped beyond reach. Then, as abruptly as they had begun, all transmissions ceased, leaving only calculations and incomplete records where continuous communication had existed moments before. Radar contact had long since been impossible, and the A330 vanished from surveillance entirely at the moment of ocean impact. For days the flight remained unaccounted for, with no visual confirmation, only fragmented clues from satellite pings and later recovered debris. The Atlantic concealed the aircraft within immense depths, delaying certainty, while the record of warnings and automated reports stood as the only testament to the final minutes. The silence that followed these transmissions amplified the eerie precision with which the aircraft had continued to speak until it no longer could. Years later, the recovery of wreckage and flight recorders explained without comfort, transforming mystery into understanding without easing its weight. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with precision, identifying environmental factors, sensor malfunctions, and the interaction of human response with automated systems. They concluded that the aircraft had entered a prolonged stall and descended steadily into the ocean, with the final transmissions confirming the sequence. Yet even with this reconstruction, the unsettling nature of the communications remained. The aircraft had been constantly signalling its state, yet no one could intervene to prevent the outcome. The meticulous record revealed clarity that arrived too late. What remains unsettling is not the absence of information, but the abundance of it, and how clarity dissolved despite the aircraft speaking almost until the end, leaving behind a record of communication that documented failure without preventing it. Every transmitted warning, every automated log, illustrates the paradox of technological precision. Even when systems functioned flawlessly, human interpretation and immediate action could not bridge the gap. The aircraft's instruments communicated tirelessly, yet understanding lagged, constrained by distance, reaction time, and the complexity of conflicting inputs. In these final minutes, Air France Flight 447 demonstrated that information alone cannot avert disaster when human comprehension cannot keep pace. The legacy of those transmissions continues to define aviation safety and the fragility of human and machine interaction at altitude. In the darkness above the Atlantic, Air France Flight 447 did not vanish in silence, but fell while still trying to explain itself. Helios Airways Flight 522. The morning sun glinted off the wings as Helios Airways Flight 522 lifted from Larnaca, climbing into clear skies while the passengers settled into routine, unaware of the invisible hazard already creeping through the cabin. Departure proceeded smoothly, with crew and passengers alike following familiar motions. Outside, the air was calm, yet within the pressurized fuselage, subtle changes were beginning, undetectable to those aboard. Flight 522 entered the first stages of its journey toward Athens, with everything appearing normal, yet the quiet signals of a critical failure had already begun to manifest, signaling a chain of events that would culminate in one of aviation's most unsettling final transmissions. A soft, almost imperceptible warning light flickered in the cockpit, signaling a minor anomaly in cabin pressurization that went unnoticed amidst the familiar checks and controls. The crew's attention was divided among routine instruments, navigation confirmations, and communications with ground control, leaving the warning largely unexamined. In the high-altitude environment, small errors can escalate quickly, and here the aircraft systems were quietly detecting conditions that, though not immediately dangerous, would progressively compromise the pilot's ability to function. The initial signal was faint, almost incidental, yet it marked the beginning of a silent and inexorable process. Radio communications began normally, but controllers soon noted phrasing that was clipped, slightly delayed, and uncharacteristically calm, hinting at a disturbance the crew could not yet fully articulate. Pilots replied to routine queries with brief confirmations, their tone lacking the usual warmth or elaboration. Observers on the ground later noted that these exchanges contained subtle irregularities, missing acknowledgements, pauses in expected responses, and minor hesitations. Each of these fragments suggested that something was subtly amiss within the cockpit, yet nothing overtly signaled the true severity of the unfolding problem. Through the cabin, the air thinned imperceptibly, and oxygen masks descended as passengers moved sluggishly, a subtle haze of incapacitation stretching quietly over rows of seats. Some passengers were unaware of the change, responding slowly to instructions and appearing disoriented. Others attempted to assist or adjust masks without realizing the diminishing effect of the rarefied atmosphere. This gradual loss of awareness mirrored the pilot's own struggle, a silent and creeping physiological assault that left the aircraft still moving along its planned path, while those aboard were steadily less capable of responding to abnormal conditions. Within the cockpit, the pilots spoke in measured tones, repeating checklists and confirming readings, yet hesitation lingered beneath their procedural calm as the true nature of the failure remained obscured. Systems indicated anomalies, alarms sounded intermittently, and minor indicators suggested irregular cabin pressure, but the severity eluded recognition. The pilots continued to operate the aircraft with professionalism, relying on training and instinct, yet each decision was subtly compromised by hypoxia, a condition invisible yet growing. The calm in their voices belied the seriousness of the slow decline, leaving ground control with transmissions that were normal on the surface but contained underlying disquiet. Minutes passed, and the physiological effects of hypoxia began eroding coordination and judgment, leaving the aircraft effectively controlled by autopilot while its human operators struggled to respond. Fine motor skills became impaired, cognitive processing slowed, and awareness of altitude and speed became increasingly limited. The autopilot compensated, maintaining course and altitude as the crew's ability to interpret warnings and take corrective action diminished. The aircraft continued to transmit status and positional data with perfect precision, creating a chilling contrast between operational stability and human incapacitation, and producing a series of final transmissions that would later appear calm yet deeply unsettling. Air traffic controllers tried repeatedly to elicit clarity from the crew, but the replies remained sparse, brief, and increasingly fragmented, a pattern that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Controllers noted unusual phrasing, abrupt responses, and moments of silence, each transmission hinting at confusion but providing no definitive cause. Requests for clarification about cabin pressurization, altitude, and navigational intent were met with limited information, leaving ground personnel grasping at fragments. The dialogue itself became part of the enigma. Calm, technical, and lacking urgency, it masked the progressive physiological decline occurring within the cockpit, heightening the suspense of the aircraft's journey. The autopilot maintained altitude and course with eerie precision, guiding the aircraft along its planned route even as the crew gradually lost awareness of their surroundings. Systems responded to programmed inputs flawlessly, keeping the plane level and on trajectory, yet all human judgment had effectively ceased. Flight instruments continued to record and transmit information, and the aircraft continued to obey navigational parameters, giving the illusion of control to any observer monitoring remotely. The discrepancy between human capacity and machine functionality created a quiet, unsettling tension, illustrating the chilling autonomy of the aircraft in the final stages of the flight. Final transmissions reached ground control in fragments. A calm acknowledgement, a clipped phrase, a hesitation, all devoid of urgency yet laden with unintended warning, their meaning only becoming clear in hindsight. These communications, brief and precise, contained no overt distress but hinted at an unrecognized problem. They were the last human words recorded from Flight 522, conveying normal procedural responses while the physiological effects of hypoxia rendered the pilots increasingly incapable. Investigators later used these fragments to reconstruct the gradual decline, noting how clarity and intent were subtly eroded, producing a haunting record of composed voices against a backdrop of invisible danger. Eventually the transmissions ceased, leaving a silent machine continuing forward, stable in trajectory but entirely without conscious guidance, as if the aircraft itself had outlasted its human operators. Radar continued to track the plane as it maintained flight along its programmed route, but all signs of active human control had vanished. The autopilot alone directed the aircraft, a mechanical guardian unaware of the human loss within. Ground observers could only watch, helpless, as Flight 522 continued in eerie stability, a flying testament to the strange and unsettling interplay between automation, human frailty, and the limits of perception. Reconstruction of the flight revealed the slow, almost imperceptible descent into incapacitation, and the chilling contrast between the calm, routine transmissions and the reality of an aircraft operating beyond human control, each message a testament to the invisible forces that determined its final moments. Investigators confirmed that cabin depressurization and hypoxia incapacitated both pilots, while the aircraft maintained its programmed course until fuel exhaustion led to the eventual crash. The final transmissions, seemingly mundane at the time, now stand as haunting echoes of a flight in which the aircraft continued to speak, even as its crew could no longer respond, leaving the mystery preserved in every recorded syllable and pause. In the quiet aftermath, Helios Airways Flight 522 remains a haunting example of an aircraft speaking to the world while its crew could no longer respond. Avianca Flight 52. Inside the cockpit of Avianca Flight 52, displays flickered with calculated fuel figures, each number a quiet reminder that reserves were dwindling while the crew coordinated their approach to New York under mounting constraints. The flight had departed Bogota earlier that day, and for hours everything had appeared routine. Yet as the plane entered the congested northeastern corridor, the crew's attention increasingly focused on dwindling fuel reserves, a variable that would soon dictate every decision. The combination of a busy airspace, weather considerations, and procedural obligations meant that each minute in the holding pattern brought them closer to a critical threshold. Early warnings from onboard systems indicated that fuel margins were tightening, prompting the pilots to review consumption rates and evaluate alternative strategies, even as air traffic remained heavy and complex. Calculations were carefully monitored and cross-checked, revealing that even minor deviations could compromise the aircraft's ability to reach the intended runway. Cabin and engine systems continued to function normally, creating a misleading sense of security. Yet for those monitoring the readings, the creeping urgency was unmistakable. Time and fuel were converging toward a point where no adjustment would suffice. Communication with air traffic control began routinely, yet subtle hesitations and clipped phrasing hinted that the crew was managing a situation more urgent than they could yet fully disclose. Standard requests were transmitted with precision, but responses contained slightly truncated confirmations and repeated clarifications. Controllers, trained to note anomalies, recognized that something in the phrasing indicated stress without overt alarm. Each exchange became a fragment of a larger narrative, the meaning of which would only be fully understood after reconstructing the flight and reviewing the final cockpit voice recordings. Passengers noticed only minor turbulence and delays, unaware that weather, holding patterns, and congested airspace were combining to stretch both time and fuel closer to critical limits. Some glanced at seatback displays, read quietly or adjusted masks, while flight attendants moved calmly through aisles. Outside, the skies were filled with clouds and distant storm cells, their presence invisible from the interior but contributing to delays that would ultimately exacerbate the fuel situation. The cabin maintained a routine calm, a stark contrast to the invisible tension playing out in the cockpit. As minutes passed, the pilots began referencing fuel explicitly, their words measured yet charged with urgency, each phrase a window into a crisis constrained by numbers and human judgment. They calculated remaining flight time, adjusted altitudes to optimize consumption, and coordinated with controllers regarding holding patterns. Even in these methodical exchanges, subtle tonal changes betrayed the growing pressure. The crew maintained composure, yet each decision carried weight far beyond procedural consequence, reflecting the delicate balance between routine operations and the mounting threat imposed by limited reserves. The aircraft threaded through repeated holding instructions, adjusting altitude and speed in an intricate balancing act designed to conserve fuel while adhering to ATC directives. Precision was required at every turn. Deviations could increase consumption and hasten the onset of a critical state. The crew executed maneuvers with disciplined attention to instruments, monitoring speed, angle and distance while simultaneously anticipating the approach sequence. In the midst of this exacting task, tension built imperceptibly, a quiet stress under which the aircraft remained mechanically stable. But human control grew increasingly strained by circumstance. Amid the intricate holding patterns, controllers began noting that Avianca Flight 52's repeated use of the phrase running out of fuel did not initially trigger the formal emergency protocol, a miscommunication compounded by terminology differences between the crew and ATC. The pilots had attempted to convey urgency while remaining procedural, but the subtle phrasing led to delays in clearance and sequencing, forcing the aircraft to continue circling longer than anticipated. This discrepancy, invisible in real time, would later be cited as a critical factor in the tragic outcome, highlighting how language and protocol intersected with mechanical precision to shape a perilous situation. ATC received increasingly fragmented transmissions, brief yet deliberate, revealing subtle shifts in cadence that suggested growing concern even as routine procedures were followed. Controllers noted repeated requests for updates, occasional clarifications, and truncated acknowledgements, all delivered in professional tones that masked the underlying severity of the situation. These communications created a record of measured urgency, a puzzle of human language balancing discipline with fear, where the final meaning would only emerge when pieced together after the aircraft's descent into crisis. Cockpit indicators glowed insistently as fuel approached critical levels, each alert emphasizing the narrowing margin for error and the consequences of even minor delays. Lights and numerical readouts documented remaining reserves, displaying diminishing thresholds with clinical accuracy. The crew monitored these warnings continuously, adjusting speed and heading to optimize consumption. Every procedure became a calculation between survival and compliance, with seconds ticking away and each adjustment carrying significant weight. The alerts were precise and unemotional, yet the context they conveyed was deeply human, reflecting the quiet desperation of a crew confronting an unavoidable limit. Attempts to descend for landing began amid tightly sequenced approaches as the crew navigated between procedural compliance and the urgent need to reach the runway before reserves ran out. Controllers coordinated multiple aircraft simultaneously, requiring precise timing and clear communication. The pilots executed descent instructions carefully, balancing safety margins, fuel conservation, and airspace constraints. Each maneuver carried the added tension of diminishing reserves, and every radio exchange revealed the narrow window in which options remained viable. The aircraft responded mechanically, yet human judgment was strained to its limit under pressure compounded by air traffic complexity. Final communications arrived in terse, measured fragments, reflecting both professional discipline and the unavoidable strain of dwindling resources pressing upon the aircraft and its crew. Words were clipped, confirmations repeated, and each acknowledgement conveyed normality while masking the growing crisis. To an observer, transmissions seemed composed. To investigators, they were chilling in retrospect. The pattern of communication revealed how discipline and training can sustain the appearance of calm even as reality edges toward catastrophe, producing unsettling messages that preserved both clarity and ambiguity. A reconstructed timeline of fuel depletion, holding patterns, and communications revealed how calm, procedural transmissions masked the tense reality of a plane operating under an invisible, escalating threat. Analysis confirmed that fuel exhaustion occurred before landing could be safely achieved, while cockpit messages documented the crew's last rational attempts to manage the crisis. Each fragment of radio communication became a record of meticulous effort, human resolve, and the inexorable limits imposed by circumstance, a reminder that even precise measured actions could not prevent disaster when resources were exhausted. Avianca Flight. 52's last words remain a haunting echo of measured communication under pressure, a record of human resolve constrained by forces beyond immediate control. Eastern Airlines Flight 401. Descending toward Miami, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 maintained a routine approach, the horizon stretching calmly beyond the cockpit as the crew followed standard landing procedures, while unaware of the anomaly that would dominate their attention. The aircraft had completed a smooth cruise from New York and entered the Florida corridor with all systems seemingly normal. Yet, in the stillness of the descent, a minor warning light flickered intermittently, a small mechanical irregularity that would soon demand the pilot's full attention. Outside, the early evening sky held nothing of note, and passengers remained comfortably unaware that an ordinary landing procedure was about to spiral into tragedy. A small indicator light flickered intermittently, failing to confirm that the nose landing gear was fully deployed, drawing the crew into meticulous but ultimately distracting troubleshooting. The engineer's manual and checklists were consulted, levers moved, and the light observed repeatedly, with each attempt to confirm its status consuming more of the crew's focus. For a brief moment, the anomaly seemed procedural rather than threatening, a routine quirk of a complex machine. Still, the crew's attention was drawn almost entirely to the instrument panel, leaving other essential aspects of the flight, particularly monitoring altitude and autopilot engagement, subtly neglected. The pilot's focus narrowed, scanning instruments and manipulating switches, each minor adjustment absorbing their attention while other critical readings, including altitude, subtly slipped from conscious monitoring. Cockpit conversation became dominated by discussions of landing gear position and repeated checks of the indicator light, a hypnotic loop of procedural troubleshooting. Systems continued to function normally otherwise, lulling both crew and passengers into a sense of routine. The contrast between the calm operational environment and the unseen drift in altitude created an invisible tension that would only be recognized in retrospect. Radio transmissions to Miami ATC continued on a normal cadence, clipped and procedural, yet fragments of hesitation and repeated confirmations hinted at a growing preoccupation within the cockpit. Controllers received standard acknowledgements and requests, entirely unaware that the crew's focus had shifted from monitoring flight path to obsessing over a single light. Each communication was meticulously phrased, professional and calm, and yet beneath the surface, the pilot's mental bandwidth had narrowed to the point that critical monitoring of instruments and systems had diminished. The calmness of the radio exchanges belied the creeping danger that would soon become catastrophic. Autopilot maintained a steady trajectory, preserving altitude and heading with quiet precision, an invisible safeguard that masked the human distraction unfolding just steps away. The aircraft remained mechanically stable as it descended along its assigned glide path, each system functioning as designed. Yet this mechanical reliability only heightened the eerie tension. The autopilot's perfect maintenance of flight concealed the subtle but accumulating errors in human oversight. In the cockpit, eyes remained fixed on the light, fingers repeated familiar motions, and the steady hum of instruments continued, unaware that a chain reaction had quietly begun. Gradual, imperceptible deviations in altitude emerged as the crew's attention remained fixed on the light, unnoticed until radar traces later revealed how minor drift accumulated into a critical descent. The plane's altitude had begun to creep downward slowly, only a few feet at first, a change too small to trigger immediate concern. Yet in combination with the autopilot's programmed response and the pilot's distraction, these small deviations compounded, creating an invisible risk. Each second spent troubleshooting further reduced the crew's awareness of the subtle but increasing danger, a peril invisible to anyone not inside the cockpit. Controllers observed subtle changes in the aircraft's flight path, but interpreted them as minor fluctuations, unaware that the crew's preoccupation with the landing gear would soon turn these small errors into a catastrophe. Radar blips and altitude readings showed slight inconsistencies, but nothing to suggest immediate danger. Air traffic controllers, trusting procedural discipline and expecting adherence to the glide path, continued coordination with other aircraft, completely unaware that Flight 401's crew was distracted by a minor mechanical anomaly that would soon dictate the outcome. The discrepancy between external observation and cockpit reality remained undetected, an unsettling precursor to disaster. The cockpit was immersed in troubleshooting and procedural repetition, a calm exterior over a growing vulnerability, while systems quietly indicated the disengagement of autopilot and the steady loss of altitude. The crew, absorbed in repeated confirmation of the landing gear status, did not immediately notice that the aircraft's autopilot had decoupled, nor that subtle but persistent downward motion had begun. Lights, dials and alerts performed their function silently, but human attention had been diverted. In those moments, the combination of mechanical precision and human distraction created an almost eerie stillness, a quiet prelude to the unfolding catastrophe. Suddenly the aircraft's descent accelerated beyond normal margins, a stark and alarming contrast to the serene procedural exchanges still being transmitted to controllers below. Alarms sounded in the cockpit as the altitude dropped rapidly, but reaction time was limited. The autopilot's disengagement had gone unnoticed until too late, and the focus on a minor instrument had delayed corrective action. Controllers continued to receive calm responses, oblivious to the reality of the situation. Within seconds, the aircraft's altitude approached a level incompatible with continued controlled flight, the juxtaposition of professional composure and escalating emergency creating a haunting tension. During the last exchanges, communications were brief and professional, punctuated by routine acknowledgements that, in retrospect, reveal a chilling dissonance between composed language and the imminent disaster. The crew transmitted confirmations, repeated check-ins and standard acknowledgements, all within the normal cadence expected during an approach. Yet every phrase was imbued with the weight of distraction, a human focus fractured by a minor anomaly. To those reviewing the transmissions later, the calm professionalism became unsettling, a stark reminder of how ordinary procedures can conceal a critical lapse until the moment of catastrophe. Post-crash investigation reconstructed how a minor mechanical anomaly, human distraction, and procedural deviation converged to produce a catastrophic loss, demonstrating the delicate balance between routine control and the unforeseen consequences of focus diverted. The indicator light, meant to signal only a minor uncertainty, became the focal point that drew attention away from essential flight monitoring. Autopilot reliability, procedural adherence, and calm communications collectively masked the growing danger. The final trajectory, radar readings, and cockpit voice recordings reveal a scenario in which everyday routines, when combined with human error, produced a hauntingly preventable outcome. In the stillness of the cockpit and over the radar screens, a simple light had diverted every eye, and in that quiet distraction, catastrophe unfolded unseen. Pan Am Flight 6. Signals from Pan Am Flight 6 cut through the static of long-range radio, a lifeline spanning hundreds of miles of empty Pacific, as the crew grappled with mechanical strain and a sky that offered no landmarks to guide them. The aircraft, a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, had departed from Honolulu bound for San Francisco, carrying both passengers and a crew accustomed to the demands of transoceanic flight. Yet the vastness of the ocean below left no margin for error, and even minor mechanical issues could quickly escalate into life-threatening challenges. As the radio crackled with static, every exchange became a tether connecting the plane to distant help and providing a thread of suspense that stretched across the expanse. An engine generator intermittently failed, sending subtle warnings to the cockpit and demanding immediate attention, the quiet hum of machinery now carrying the weight of urgency over such a vast, unpopulated expanse. The failure did not immediately compromise flight capability, but it introduced an invisible tension. One electrical system faltering in an isolated environment could rapidly propagate into more serious complications. Instruments flickered momentarily, prompting the crew to adjust power distribution and monitor other systems with heightened focus. In the endless blue beneath and the featureless sky above, the aircraft's mechanical reliability became both a lifeline and a source of unease, each warning light a reminder of fragility. The pilots conferred in measured tones, consulting checklists while balancing the pressure of continuous flight and the knowledge that help was distant and contingent on clear communication. Every adjustment, every switch flipped, carried weight beyond its mechanical function. It was a decision made in the quiet, isolated theatre of the mid-Pacific. The first officer relayed technical data while the captain calculated potential landing locations, factoring in the vast distances to the nearest support ships and the ocean's unpredictable behaviour. Their professional calm belied the internal awareness of how quickly conditions could worsen, a balance between competence and the lurking threat of uncertainty. Every transmission to naval vessels and Coast Guard stations was brief yet deliberate, conveying essential information about altitude, heading, and mechanical status, a record of survival strategies under extraordinary isolation. Each message contained coded urgency, phrases repeated to ensure clarity, and a quiet precision that would later serve as a testament to the crew's professionalism. Radio operators far below responded with procedural efficiency, plotting intercepts and coordinating support, the distance and the ocean's indifference amplifying the stakes of every exchange. The transmissions were calm, yet the subtext of impending danger was implicit, resonating in the rhythm of each concise report. Passengers moved with quiet attentiveness, guided by crew instructions that were calm but precise, the subtle tension in the cabin hinting at the underlying challenge of navigating uncertainty over the open ocean. Flight attendants repeated instructions on emergency procedures and seated passengers strategically, preparing for a scenario that remained theoretical but increasingly probable. Children were hushed by the staff, and travellers adjusted to the unusual stillness, aware of the crew's preoccupation even if the details remained opaque. In the absence of external cues, the cabin became a microcosm of controlled anxiety, a space where human awareness and procedural discipline intersected under pressure. Navigation over the open ocean offered no reference points, forcing reliance on instruments and radio fixes, and the crew's vigilance became a quiet, continuous negotiation with uncertainty. Celestial sightings, radio triangulation, and barometric readings combined to form the aircraft's invisible map, each calculation essential to maintaining the correct course. Small discrepancies could accumulate over time, and the crew continuously cross-checked readings, ensuring that drift did not carry them out of position for potential rescue or emergency landing. The ocean's vast monotony left no margin for error, demanding absolute precision and relentless attention to detail. Waves swelled beneath the aircraft, clouds thickened into unbroken sheets, and the storm's increasing intensity tested the limits of both the plane and those guiding it through a featureless expanse. Wind gusts buffeted the fuselage, precipitation streaked across windows, and the horizon disappeared in a uniform grey, transforming the environment into an almost alien landscape. Pilots adjusted for turbulence, balancing throttle and attitude with subtle shifts, each movement measured to maintain stability while minimizing stress on the airframe. The storm's physical presence mirrored the psychological weight of isolation, an external reflection of the stakes inherent in every decision. Emergency coordination became paramount, with the crew relaying precise positions, fuel assessments, and procedural instructions to awaiting Coast Guard ships, every word carrying weight as naval responders prepared for the challenge of rescuing a large aircraft at sea. Vessels manoeuvred carefully, tracking coordinates relayed over radio frequencies that wavered with distance and atmospheric interference. The crew's messages conveyed not panic but methodical urgency, a series of deliberate actions designed to maximize the likelihood of a safe water landing. Each exchange revealed the intricate choreography required to synchronize human skill, mechanical reliability, and environmental unpredictability. Descent toward the Pacific demanded meticulous attention to angle, speed, and structural limitations, each adjustment a silent negotiation between gravity, wind, and fragile mechanical reliability. Pilots managed flap settings, engine power, and rate of descent with exacting precision, aware that even a minor miscalculation could jeopardize the landing. Waves below seemed to rise and fall in unmeasurable increments, each swell presenting a potential hazard, each gust of wind threatening to destabilize an already tenuous balance. The aircraft's interaction with the ocean became a dialogue between human skill and natural forces, a suspenseful interplay that underscored the peril of isolation. Once contact with the water was made, the crew guided passengers into life rafts and ensured survival equipment was deployed efficiently, while maintaining radio contact to direct ships navigating toward them through turbulent waves. Rescue vessels approached cautiously, informed by coordinates transmitted earlier, each minute stretching as the sea's surface continued to shift beneath the plane and rafts. Crew members moved with calm authority, the passengers following instructions with careful attentiveness, their survival dependent on procedure executed under extreme stress. The procedural discipline that had maintained order throughout the flight now ensured lives were preserved despite the ocean's unpredictability. Piecing together the events revealed how mechanical strain, environmental isolation, and careful procedural coordination coalesced to produce a narrow survival scenario, revealing the tension embedded within every calm professional transmission. Detailed analysis of flight logs, radio communications, and survivor accounts showed that every decision, from minor instrument checks to final ditching maneuvers, contributed to the eventual outcome. The episode highlighted the delicate balance between human skill, machine reliability, and environmental variables, and how, even in apparent calm, high-stakes uncertainty can dominate events in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Amid the vast indifferent Pacific, Pan Am Flight 6 became both a vessel of human endurance and a record of how isolation transforms routine procedure into a haunting struggle against nature. Swissair Flight 111. A faint haze began to curl through the cockpit of Swissair Flight 111, unnoticed at first, as the aircraft cruised steadily over the Atlantic, and the subtle anomaly would soon escalate into a deadly crisis. The McDonnell Douglas MD-11 had departed from New York's JFK Airport en route to Geneva, carrying passengers and crew unaware of the peril that was silently developing in the overhead panels and behind walls. The haze was initially attributed to minor electrical fluctuation, but small warning signals quickly indicated that a fire could be developing within the aircraft's structure. Every routine gauge and instrument reading became a point of scrutiny as the crew began to sense that normal flight procedures would soon be insufficient. The pilots exchanged brief, professional glances, registering the first traces of smoke that suggested an electrical or material malfunction, and immediately initiated standard inspection protocols while alerting each other to the potential hazard. Checklists were pulled from memory and manuals consulted, each step executed with methodical precision. The captain requested visual confirmation of any unusual indicators, while the first officer monitored multiple systems simultaneously. Though the initial smoke appeared minor, it carried the invisible weight of risk, a subtle but unmistakable sign that the flight was veering toward emergency conditions. Calm but urgent radio transmissions to Halifax Air Traffic Control conveyed the situation, each phrase carefully measured yet revealing the invisible urgency growing within the cockpit as smoke density slowly increased. The crew provided headings, altitude, and details of the anomaly, requesting assistance without panic but with unmistakable clarity. ATC operators noted the professional tone, yet recognized the implication, a flight facing a problem that could deteriorate rapidly over open ocean. Each transmission became part of a record that documented the crew's awareness, competence, and growing concern, a transcript of escalating danger masked by procedural calm. In the cabin, passengers noticed a faint odor and slight haze, prompting crew members to reassure them while methodically preparing for emergency procedures, the quiet tension slowly seeping into every corner of the aircraft. Flight attendants moved strategically, briefing passengers on seatbelt protocols and potential evacuation measures while monitoring for signs of distress. Children and travellers alike were conscious of the unusual atmosphere, sensing an intangible unease even as no immediate danger appeared in sight. The cabin, normally a space of routine and comfort, became a venue for subtle apprehension, where the crew's calm instructions underscored the silent escalation of peril. Technical diagnosis consumed the pilot's attention as instruments were monitored and electrical panels scrutinized in an effort to isolate the source of smoke, a procedural race against time as conditions silently worsened. Temperature readings from overhead wiring were observed carefully, and systems were selectively powered down in attempts to contain the hazard. Each decision was deliberate, balancing the risk of further mechanical compromise with the imperative of maintaining flight control. Even minor miscalculations could prove catastrophic, and every instrument reading, switch, and observation was weighed in the context of human lives and aircraft integrity. The decision to divert to Halifax became unavoidable, with navigational adjustments carefully calculated, ATC updates relayed, and contingency plans reviewed. Balancing mechanical limitations with the need for rapid arrival, charts were consulted, distances calculated, and alternate landing options considered in real time. Flight crew coordinated with cabin staff, ensuring that passengers remained informed while emergency procedures were prepared. The aircraft altered its trajectory over the Atlantic, and every transmission to air traffic control reflected a precise, deliberate sequence of steps designed to maximize the chances of a controlled emergency landing despite the invisible but pervasive threat. Smoke thickened and alarms chimed intermittently, reducing cockpit visibility and signaling that fire had begun to spread, while each second heightened the stakes of the flight and the importance of maintaining control. The haze became denser, obscuring critical panels and instruments, forcing pilots to rely on memory and tactile feedback to operate systems. The audible alarms, now frequent and insistent, punctuated the cockpit's otherwise controlled environment, heightening awareness of the rapidly deteriorating situation. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, indifferent to the human struggle unfolding above, and every moment emphasized the aircraft's vulnerability. Checklists were executed with precision, cabin crew coordinated passenger safety measures, and every action reinforced the dual challenge of procedural adherence and survival under an invisible escalating threat. Oxygen masks and emergency lighting systems were checked, passenger positions reviewed, and communication with flight attendants maintained, all while the cockpit team focused on critical systems and fire containment. The juxtaposition of calm procedure and mounting danger created a tension that was both palpable and invisible. The crew's effectiveness measured against the speed and unpredictability of the fire's progression. As the aircraft descended toward Halifax, pilots maintained an instrument-guided approach, adjusting for turbulence and visibility limitations, while radio transmissions continued to convey calm professionalism even as conditions became perilous. Radar readings, altitude corrections, and coordinated timing with emergency services ensured that the flight remained on a survivable trajectory. Smoke and heat intensified, complicating control inputs and cockpit visibility, yet the crew continued to prioritize clarity and precision in communication. Every minute was a calculated effort to preserve order amid a situation defined by both urgency and the unseen hazards of electrical fire. Final moments were defined by the rapid degradation of systems, smoke infiltration, and critical maneuvering, as the aircraft approached its trajectory with the last remaining measures of control in place. Despite the crew's efforts, flames spread behind panels and through insulation, weakening structural elements and challenging the aircraft's remaining flight capabilities. Communications with ATC persisted until the final seconds, each transmission a meticulous record of position, heading, and crew observation. These messages, calm in tone yet heavy with urgency, formed an indelible log of human skill exercised in the face of an invisible and lethal force. Wiring insulation, flammable materials, and human decision-making converged to create an invisible yet lethal progression, illustrating how every calm transmission had masked escalating danger. Investigators pieced together cockpit voice recordings, system data, and debris evidence to reconstruct the sequence of events, revealing how procedural adherence had delayed catastrophe but could not overcome the rapid spread of fire. Every communication, every adjustment, and every decision became part of a record demonstrating both competence and the fragile limits of human control against unforeseen mechanical failures. In the span of minutes, Swissair Flight 111 transformed from a routine transatlantic crossing into a silent, smoke-filled struggle, leaving only the record of communications as evidence of the crew's desperate vigilance. EgyptAir Flight 990. Over the vast Atlantic, EgyptAir Flight 990 maintained a smooth transatlantic course, yet hidden within the cockpit's routine communications were subtle indicators that would precede a rapid and unexplained descent. The Boeing 767-366ER had departed from John F. Kennedy International Airport bound for Cairo, carrying hundreds of passengers and crew, all unaware that the final moments of the flight would become a subject of intense investigation. Initially, instruments reflected routine readings, and nothing in the outward appearance of the flight suggested the calamity that would emerge. Yet within the cockpit, the interplay of mechanical systems and human actions would soon produce unsettling transmissions that hinted at an extraordinary sequence of events. Pilots monitored instruments and autopilot settings with practiced attention, executing standard flight procedures while preparing for the long crossing, unaware that unusual inputs would soon alter the aircraft's trajectory. The captain reviewed charts, cross-checked navigation data, and consulted systems while the first officer maintained steady control. Routine procedures were followed precisely, including altitude checks, autopilot configuration, and communication with ATC. Yet even in this climate of procedural normalcy, minor anomalies began to manifest. Slight fluctuations in autopilot response and unexpected adjustments to control surfaces that, while not immediately alarming, signaled that the aircraft was diverging from the expected parameters. A slight deviation in control column pressure first appeared almost imperceptible as the autopilot disengaged momentarily and the plane responded to inputs that were not fully accounted for by procedural norms. The aircraft's nose pitched downward incrementally, unnoticed by some instruments yet recorded by the flight data recorder. The first officer adjusted trim and autopilot settings, attempting to stabilize flight while simultaneously monitoring engine output and altitude indicators. These small but significant deviations would soon compound, creating a scenario where mechanical response and human intention became entangled in a trajectory that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Radio transmissions to ATC initially reflected calm professionalism, yet the brevity and measured tone would later be contrasted with the increasingly urgent warnings that accompanied the aircraft's descent. Early communications included altitude reports and positional updates, delivered in standard procedural phrasing. As the aircraft began to descend more rapidly than expected, the tone shifted subtly, with language that reflected awareness of an emerging anomaly. Controllers logged each transmission, noting precise times, headings, and altitude changes, establishing a meticulous record of the aircraft's final interactions with those tracking it from the ground. Conflicting cockpit signals and unexpected system responses created a tension in control dynamics, leaving investigators to analyze the interplay between human input and mechanical reaction in the final moments. Flight data showed unusual pitch adjustments and control column movements that did not correspond to standard procedures. Autopilot systems reacted to input in ways that compounded the descent, and cockpit voice recordings captured discussion between crew members attempting to reconcile the aircraft's unexpected behavior with operational norms. Each decision, each adjustment, carried weight, yet the exact sequence of intentional versus reactive inputs remains a subject of debate. Altitude bled away rapidly as the aircraft pitched and accelerated, instruments recording speed and attitude that underscored the severity of a descent whose exact cause remains partially unresolved. The 767's velocity increased steadily, and stabilizer trim and autopilot interactions were unable to arrest the downward trajectory. Flight attendants, aware of unusual movement, checked passengers while simultaneously attempting to maintain cabin order. The rapid descent highlighted the interplay of mechanical forces, human decisions, and procedural limitations, creating a scenario in which every moment was critical and irreversible. Air traffic control observed the sudden drop in altitude with growing concern, logging timestamps, headings, and rate of descent changes as they attempted to guide the aircraft while grappling with the unfolding emergency. Controllers queried the pilots repeatedly, requesting confirmation of altitude and flight intentions. Their responses were measured, alternating between procedural clarity and acknowledgement of unusual events. The disparity between expected altitude trends and actual readings created tension, emphasizing the gravity of the descent and the challenge of interpreting the cockpit's transmissions under extraordinary circumstances. Passengers experienced abrupt sensations of movement and noise, the cabin shaking subtly yet insistently, leaving an impression of sudden chaos despite the crew's measured communications and procedural efforts. Seatbelts restrained movement, and overhead bins rattled, creating an audible record of the descent's effects. The crew's calm instructions attempted to stabilize passenger awareness, but the subtle acceleration and unusual motion introduced an unmistakable sense of instability. Within this environment, the human perception of danger contrasted sharply with the technical precision of the aircraft's monitoring systems, heightening the psychological tension in the cabin. Flight data recorder analysis later revealed rapid changes in pitch, speed, and control inputs, reflecting a dissonance between the aircraft's response and intended commands that contributed to the mysterious final trajectory. Every control surface movement, trim adjustment, and autopilot reaction was captured in detail, providing investigators with a granular record of mechanical performance and human input. This data, juxtaposed with cockpit voice recordings, illustrated the complexity of the descent and underscored how unsettling transmissions had been the only indicators of the unfolding anomaly before the aircraft disappeared from radar coverage. The aircraft disappeared from radar as the final descent concluded, leaving only scattered communications, partial system readings, and witness accounts to reconstruct the moments before impact with the Atlantic. Controllers tracked the flight until it vanished, while oceanic radar and radar-based projections were later used to approximate impact location. The absence of further transmissions left investigators reliant on pre-existing cockpit data, FDR readings, and CVR analysis to piece together the sequence of events. The suddenness of the disappearance amplified the mystery, underscoring how rapid and inexplicable the descent had been despite recorded communications. Through study of cockpit voice recordings, flight data, and physical debris, it was found that unsettling transmissions had recorded both procedural diligence and an enigmatic sequence of control inputs whose meaning remains debated. Reports examined autopilot settings, control column positions, and cockpit dialogue, highlighting a pattern of interactions that hinted at unusual human behavior while remaining intertwined with mechanical function. The combination of technical analysis and voice recordings provided partial narrative, revealing the unsettling reality that some aspects of the descent, its exact initiation and intent, could not be fully explained. In a matter of minutes, EgyptAir Flight 990 became a record of rapid descent and unresolved intent, leaving only traces of communication to hint at the aircraft's final, inexplicable course. Varig Flight 254. The cockpit of Varig Flight 254 hummed with routine activity, instruments and dials recording every parameter as the crew prepared for the domestic route ahead, unaware that small miscalculations would turn ordinary transmissions into a chronicle of mounting disorientation. The Boeing 737-241 had departed from Sao Paulo Guarulhos Airport, bound for Belém, carrying passengers and cargo across the dense expanse of Brazil. At first, the flight unfolded with procedural normalcy, standard altitude, autopilot engagement, and routine radio checks. Yet beneath this surface, subtle deviations in course would quietly begin, unnoticed by the crew, and the early radio transmissions would later reveal the first signs of growing uncertainty. Crew members followed standard procedures, programming the autopilot and reviewing route charts, each action reflecting careful attention to expected waypoints and fuel management, while maintaining communication with regional control towers. The captain cross-checked the navigational instruments, while the first officer verified radio beacon signals. Every action adhered to operational standards, checking headings, altitudes and engine performance, ensuring the aircraft remained within safe parameters. Even routine observations were documented and communicated precisely, reflecting an environment of professional diligence. These preparations, meticulous as they were, could not prevent the subtle errors that would soon accumulate into a life-threatening deviation from the intended flight path. A subtle misinterpretation of headings emerged, unnoticed at first, causing the aircraft to drift off its intended course while instruments indicated minor discrepancies easily overlooked in the cockpit's rhythm. The captain set the intended heading, but a single incorrect input shifted the course several degrees off plan. For a time, visual cues and radio signals were interpreted as confirming the trajectory, though in reality the aircraft was now heading toward remote terrain with limited landmarks. Each mile of deviation compounded the eventual challenge, and the cockpit environment remained calm, giving no outward signal of the growing navigational anomaly. Landmarks began to fail in matching charted expectations, and tension quietly mounted as pilots cross-checked radio beacons and visual cues against an increasingly uncertain trajectory. Rivers appeared smaller, forested expanses denser, and the horizon offered little to confirm location. The crew noted the inconsistencies and began calculating corrections, but the cumulative impact of the initial misreading made alignment with the intended route increasingly elusive. These adjustments, based on observation and instrument readings, could not fully compensate for the error, and each transmission to control hinted at the subtle unease building in the cockpit. Transmissions to air traffic control grew measured yet increasingly tense, conveying position estimates and seeking confirmation, each word a factual acknowledgement of the mounting confusion over the aircraft's exact location. The crew provided coordinates and requested bearings, while controllers attempted to cross-reference radar and navigational data. Each communication reflected a mixture of procedural accuracy and escalating concern, as both crew and controllers recognized that the flight path did not align with expectations. The exchanges were precise, yet the undercurrent of uncertainty imbued every word with tension that would later become a focal point of investigation. Awareness of fuel limitations began to shape decision-making, as calculations of remaining endurance introduced urgency into cockpit communications, while guiding subsequent course adjustments with precision and caution. The crew recalculated remaining fuel reserves, factoring in the extended flight time due to deviation. Each maneuver and heading correction was weighed against consumption rates, adding a layer of procedural stress to an already tense environment. The aircraft was not yet in immediate danger, but the growing realization that available fuel might not be sufficient for an extended diversion intensified focus, and contributed to the overall sense of mounting unease captured in their transmissions. Beneath the aircraft, dense jungle and meandering rivers passed unseen, with the challenges of distance, hazy visibility, and unfamiliar terrain compounding the difficulty of confirming location, heightening both procedural and psychological tension. The vastness of the Amazon interior offered no landmarks that could easily confirm their course, leaving the crew reliant on instruments and intermittent radio signals. Shadows of clouds distorted perception, and the isolation of the flight corridor amplified the sense of uncertainty. Every adjustment to heading or altitude was executed carefully, yet the psychological weight of navigating without clear reference points quietly added to the strain in the cockpit. Corrective maneuvers were initiated in a careful sequence, headings and altitudes adjusted according to ATC instructions, yet the aircraft remained significantly off course, underscoring the subtle but consequential error that had accumulated over the flight. Radio beacon triangulation suggested partial alignment with intended airways, but discrepancies persisted, requiring the crew to constantly re-evaluate their options. Each procedural adjustment was methodical, calculated, and based on verified data, but the original miscalculation created a ripple effect that even careful navigation could not immediately correct. The unsettling transmissions recorded in these moments would later become key evidence in understanding the sequence of events. Passengers felt intermittent turbulence and heard crew announcements that, while calm and procedural, hinted at an underlying recognition of irregularity, creating a quiet apprehension in the cabin atmosphere. Flight attendants relayed information clearly, emphasizing safety measures and seatbelt compliance, yet the subtle unease was perceptible. The hum of the engines and occasional course corrections created a backdrop for quiet anxiety, as passengers registered the crew's controlled but deliberate efforts to manage the flight. No overt panic occurred, but the cabin's awareness of something unusual subtly mirrored the cockpit's growing awareness of navigational disorientation. The final moments unfolded with a controlled descent toward terrain that had not been anticipated, as the aircraft's path intersected with the dense forest below, leaving traces that investigators would later use to reconstruct its tragic end. Flight instruments documented the descent, speed, and heading, while the radio transmissions captured the crew's last procedural attempts to regain clarity. The aircraft impacted terrain in a location that had not been mapped for routine navigation, complicating rescue efforts. Investigators later pieced together these final transmissions alongside physical evidence, creating a timeline that reconstructed both the gradual error accumulation and the moments leading to the crash. Analysis of cockpit voice recordings, flight data, and post-crash reconstruction revealed how navigational misinterpretation, procedural adherence, and environmental factors combined to transform routine transmissions into an unnerving chronicle of error. Each recorded transmission was examined for tone, precision, and content, illustrating how the crew's professionalism coexisted with escalating uncertainty. Investigators documented every course adjustment, radio exchange, and fuel calculation, demonstrating that what might have appeared to be routine communication was in fact a window into a progressively deteriorating situation. The final transmissions provided both clarity and ambiguity, reflecting the complexity of human and mechanical interaction under stress. Across the endless canopy of the Amazon, Varig Flight 254's misread course left only its radio transmissions as enduring testimony to a flight undone by subtle error and the weight of isolation. Flying Tigerline Flight 66. On a clear morning over the Pacific, Flight 66 carried cargo vital to military and commercial operations, its flight plan meticulously plotted for efficiency and safety. Beneath the steady climb, subtle irregularities appeared on monitoring equipment, enough to draw the crew's attention and foreshadow the rapid escalation that would soon turn routine transmissions into unsettling warnings. Initially minor, these fluctuations went largely unnoticed outside the cockpit, yet inside, the instruments quietly recorded deviations that would soon culminate in a series of urgent communications to air traffic control. Initially, the flight proceeded as expected. Autopilot engaged, navigation verified, and fuel levels confirmed, while the crew carried out the standard cross-checks required for an oceanic route. Each system behaved predictably, the engines responding to throttle adjustments with the familiar hum of regulated power, and the aircraft seemed to glide steadily across the vast expanse. Yet the quiet precision of the cockpit concealed the anomalies that were gradually manifesting within electrical and hydraulic systems, small discrepancies that could not yet be fully interpreted but would soon dictate the sequence of events. A slight fluctuation in engine pressure became apparent, subtle but uncharacteristic, prompting the pilots to consult the manuals and confirm that readings were within operational limits. The anomaly was intermittent, appearing and disappearing with small variations in throttle and altitude, creating a momentary unease in an otherwise routine operation. The co-pilot noted the irregularities aloud, suggesting closer observation, while the captain adjusted minor inputs to maintain course, unaware that these initial signs were precursors to a cascading mechanical problem that would soon compromise the aircraft's stability. Within minutes, multiple warning lights illuminated simultaneously, indicating hydraulic pressure loss and fuel imbalance, and the crew quickly recognized the severity of the situation as the aircraft began to respond unpredictably to control inputs. The cockpit atmosphere shifted from methodical calm to heightened focus, with every instrument and dial scrutinized for confirmation of what was rapidly becoming an emergency. Procedures shifted from routine monitoring to emergency protocol, and the crew began a systematic review of checklists designed for exactly such critical failures, each step executed with deliberate care as the clock counted down toward potential catastrophe. Communications with air traffic control intensified, the pilots providing precise information about the developing mechanical failure while requesting guidance and clearance for possible corrective maneuvers. Every word transmitted reflected both urgency and professionalism, with coded emergency phrases interwoven with factual updates about the aircraft's status. Controllers monitored the transmissions closely, attempting to triangulate position and anticipate next steps, while the crew's calm yet tense delivery masked the immediate danger that mechanical anomalies were imposing on their high-altitude trajectory. Despite rapid adjustments, the aircraft responded inconsistently, requiring coordinated effort to stabilize heading and altitude. Autopilot systems began to malfunction under the compounded stress of hydraulic issues, forcing manual input for even minor corrections. The pilots alternated between adjusting controls and referencing system diagnostics. Each attempt to regain stability was limited by the growing mechanical instability. Every maneuver demanded precise timing, and the margin for error diminished with each passing second, amplifying the suspense embedded in the unfolding final transmissions. Data from the cockpit voice recorder later revealed how the crew's repeated throttle adjustments and stabilizer corrections caused subtle vibrations throughout the fuselage, which were noted alongside fluctuating fuel flow and engine temperature. These details, once overlooked in post-flight routine, became critical in understanding how small mechanical inconsistencies compounded into larger systemic failures. Investigators highlighted how the crew's real-time problem-solving had mitigated potential catastrophic loss for several minutes, extending the time the aircraft remained partially controllable before the descent became inevitable. Environmental conditions added further challenge. High-altitude winds, sparse radar coverage, and the immensity of the Pacific below limited situational awareness. The vast, featureless expanse beneath the aircraft offered no landmarks, leaving the crew reliant on instruments alone to determine altitude, heading, and proximity to emergency diversion points. Subtle atmospheric shifts and cloud formations distorted perception, and turbulence occasionally jolted the plane, adding physical confirmation to the psychological pressure building in the cockpit. Every second of delay in decision-making had an immediate consequence for the aircraft's trajectory. Crew coordination became a continuous, intense exchange of observations and commands, each pilot adapting to real-time feedback from instruments while anticipating the next critical moment. One pilot monitored engine output while the other adjusted stabilizers, verbalizing every adjustment and outcome to maintain a shared mental picture of the aircraft's status. This rapid-fire communication, punctuated by short bursts of technical terminology and procedural commands, illustrated the delicate balance of human skill against the unforgiving nature of mechanical failure, as well as the professionalism that defined the final moments of Flight 66. As control systems deteriorated further, the aircraft initiated a gradual but unplanned descent, with the pilots attempting corrective inputs that only partially mitigated the malfunction. Altitude readings fluctuated, and attempts to maintain heading were countered by intermittent hydraulic failure. making each minor maneuver a struggle against both gravity and compromised equipment. Radio transmissions captured the precise nature of these adjustments, the language clipped and factual, documenting a sequence of actions meant to preserve the aircraft while foreshadowing the eventual loss of control that would culminate in impact. Flight 66 ultimately descended into the Pacific, its impact scattering debris across a remote area that would later serve as the key to reconstructing the final sequence. Investigators pieced together data from the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recordings, analysing engine performance, hydraulic pressure fluctuations, and the timing of control inputs. The debris pattern confirmed the trajectory suggested by the last transmissions, and the combination of mechanical failure and environmental challenge provided the critical context for understanding how rapidly a routine cargo flight had transformed into a sequence of urgent, unsettling communications. The post-accident analysis revealed how early, subtle indicators had been overtaken by cascading failures, and how Flight 66's transmissions, once routine, had become a precise record of human expertise confronting unavoidable mechanical breakdown at high altitude. Each emergency call, each adjustment reported to air traffic control, and each cockpit observation formed a detailed chronicle of skill meeting crisis. Investigators concluded that while no error on the part of the crew caused the malfunction, the recordings of their last actions would endure as both evidence and testament to the narrow margin between control and catastrophe. Traversing the vast Pacific, Flying Tigerline Flight 66 left behind only its last transmissions as a haunting chronicle of urgency, skill, and the fragile boundary between control and catastrophe. LaMia Flight 2933. The flight deck of LaMia Flight 2933 was occupied by a team balancing routine pre-flight checks against the looming pressure of a tight schedule, with a full complement of passengers whose destination carried both expectation and urgency. The crew methodically verified fuel levels, weight distribution and navigation systems, their actions deliberate yet shadowed by the knowledge that time was already pressing against the flight's carefully planned itinerary. Outside the cockpit, the Colombian city of Santa Cruz de la Sierra prepared for the team's departure, unaware that subtle operational compromises in the flight plan would soon transform an ordinary journey into a harrowing series of last transmissions. Takeoff proceeded without incident, the aircraft descending along its planned corridor while air traffic control monitored a flight that initially seemed routine, yet small operational compromises were already beginning to take shape. The engines maintained steady thrust as the plane climbed into thin air, and the autopilot held a precise heading over the Andean foothills. Although nothing immediately appeared amiss, flight data recorded minor variations in fuel consumption that hinted at a trajectory more precarious than normal, and the crew remained focused on maintaining procedural discipline while navigating early signs of risk. Fuel calculations conducted before departure had been borderline, leaving little room for contingencies, and the crew monitored consumption with growing concern as minor deviations appeared early in the climb. Each kilometre flown demanded careful attention, and the engineers' pre-flight estimates were tested against the reality of engine performance and environmental factors. The modest overages, while initially manageable, suggested that the aircraft's endurance would be tighter than originally planned, planting the first seeds of unease in a flight that had been scheduled with barely sufficient reserves. Unexpected reroutes and delays further strained the aircraft's limited reserves, each adjustment requiring careful consideration and highlighting the tension between operational constraints and regulatory safety margins. Altered air traffic paths, combined with minor vector corrections to maintain separation from other flights, lengthened the journey incrementally. These adjustments were routine in isolation, yet in combination with the aircraft's fuel limitations, they created an undercurrent of urgency that quietly shifted the flight's character from routine to pressured, with every new decision requiring rapid calculation against a narrowing margin of safety. The aircraft's fuel monitoring system also recorded subtle discrepancies between expected consumption and actual flow, which would later reveal how even small operational deviations compounded over the flight's duration. Investigators noted that factors such as slightly higher engine power settings, minor atmospheric turbulence, and the additional weight of cargo all contributed to accelerated fuel use. These cumulative effects, though seemingly trivial at the time, provided crucial insight into why the crew's decision-making became increasingly constrained and why every subsequent maneuver had to account for a diminishing safety margin. The cockpit filled with procedural chatter as warning indicators signaled dwindling fuel, prompting the crew to evaluate options for diversion while attempting to maintain the original flight plan. Each alert triggered a swift checklist response, with fuel gauges and engine readouts scrutinized against projected consumption. The pilot's communications blended technical accuracy with urgent pragmatism, describing reserve levels, distance to airports, and possible alternative approaches. These messages, though calm in tone, captured the growing reality that time and fuel were converging toward a critical threshold. Reaching out to nearby airports and requesting priority landing brought urgent exchanges with controllers, each transmission carefully phrased to convey both operational status and immediate necessity. Controllers relayed distances, weather conditions, and approach limitations, providing options that required quick decisions under pressure. Every request reflected the pilot's awareness of dwindling reserves, and every response underscored the delicate balance between routine air traffic management and the extraordinary demands imposed by an aircraft approaching a critical limit. Altitude adjustments and speed modifications became increasingly frequent, reflecting both technical requirements and human judgment under stress. As the aircraft responded to the compounded effects of limited reserves and routing changes, cockpit recordings later revealed how minute throttle adjustments created subtle shifts in fuel flow and how minor deviations in heading could affect descent timing and approach angle. The crew's attention to detail intensified, with each input designed to conserve energy and maintain safe altitude, yet these efforts were constrained by the unforgiving arithmetic of fuel versus distance over the mountainous terrain below. The final cockpit communications documented a sequence of precise, urgent reports, with fuel warnings, position updates, and calculated requests for landing permission, marking the last recorded words from Flight 2933. Every syllable was methodical, a mixture of factual description and procedural code, illustrating a disciplined response to a rapidly deteriorating situation. Investigators later noted that these transmissions provided a nearly minute-by-minute record of the flight's final operational decisions, revealing both human competence and the unyielding limitations imposed by a constrained fuel load. As the plane approached its intended airport, environmental factors such as cloud cover and limited visibility compounded the operational challenges, demanding rapid adaptation from a crew already constrained by fuel limitations. Navigating through dense layers of cloud while estimating the approach visually required constant adjustment to instruments and judgment of altitude and speed. These conditions intensified the need for precise coordination, and each corrective input reflected the crew's attempts to merge technical procedure with real-time sensory assessment in a final effort to reach the runway safely. Post-accident analysis revealed the trajectory, fuel metrics, and timing of communications, showing how each decision and procedural action contributed to the final moments of the flight in a clear yet haunting sequence. Investigators reconstructed the path using flight recorders, cockpit communications, and radar tracking, tracing how incremental decisions and minor deviations combined with limited fuel reserves to produce the catastrophic outcome. The final transmissions, preserved through careful data recovery, offered a window into the interplay of skill, circumstance, and operational pressure that defined the last minutes of Flight 2933. Scrutiny of the aircraft's last transmissions indicated the precise intersection of human decision-making, operational pressure, and technical limitation, leaving an enduring record of urgency and uncertainty. Each communication, each adjustment, and each procedural confirmation contributed to a detailed record that would inform future regulations and safety protocols. The flight, while tragic in its outcome, serves as a stark reminder of the invisible forces shaping aviation incidents, how schedules, fuel planning, and human judgment converge in moments of high-stakes uncertainty. LaMia Flight 2933 vanished into the night, leaving only its transmissions as a stark testament to the invisible forces that can convert routine operations into a cascade of peril. Air New Zealand Flight 901. Antarctica's frozen expanse stretched beneath the aircraft, its featureless whiteness masking the subtle contours that would soon challenge both instruments and human perception as Flight 901 traced its route toward the continent. The DC-10 carried passengers on what was intended as a scenic journey over the Ross Ice Shelf, a flight that had become a familiar attraction of the airline's Antarctic offerings. Beneath the fuselage, glaciers reflected sunlight with a harsh, blinding glare, and the landscape's uniformity made it almost impossible to discern valleys from plateaus. Even seasoned crew members noted the eerie stillness, a silence that seemed to hold the power to distort scale and distance. Observers later remarked that the passengers could see nothing but the brilliant, endless white, yet the cockpit instruments would gradually reveal the true challenge of navigating such an environment. Clouds hung like sheer veils across the polar sky, their shifting density forcing the crew to rely increasingly on navigation systems as visual references became unreliable amid the blinding glare of snowfields. The DC-10's radar and altimeters became the crew's primary guide, as even distant ridgelines appeared to vanish beneath the diffuse light. Layers of mist and thin cloud sheets created the illusion that the aircraft was higher and further from the terrain than it truly was. The subtle interplay of sun, snow, and clouds created a deceptive horizon, flattening perspectives and making each adjustment in altitude a careful guess. The passengers remained unaware of these complications, trusting the visible sky and instruments to provide guidance, while the crew balanced vigilance with an uneasy sense that the environment might betray them. Charts and coordinates lined the cockpit walls, meticulously reviewed before departure, yet the stark landscape below blurred the distinction between mapped paths and the reality of ice and rock hidden beneath layers of mist. Flight planning had accounted for the Antarctic's extreme conditions, and navigators had double-checked every waypoint and heading. Yet as Flight 901 proceeded, the visual dissonance between the charts and what lay beneath began to weigh on judgment. Subtle shifts in flight path were compounded by the reflections and whiteout effects below, and the aircraft's actual position began diverging from the projected course. What seemed like routine navigation gradually became a study in the fragile balance between expectation and observable reality, an unseen tension recorded in cockpit communications. As altitude increased, reflections off the glaciers created an optical paradox, flattening the horizon and making it nearly impossible to judge distance or slope with certainty. Snowfields shimmered like mirrored surfaces, merging with cloud cover to create an uninterrupted plain of white. Mountains appeared as faint shadows, their true size and position obscured by light scattering in the diffused horizon. Even with instruments displaying precise measurements, the human eye struggled to interpret depth and elevation. Crew members were aware that the landscape could deceive them, yet no amount of prior experience could entirely mitigate the illusion. Each moment aloft brought an added layer of uncertainty, a tension that grew incrementally as Flight 901 continued toward the heart of the continent. Conversations in the cockpit grew tense yet measured, each call between pilots balancing procedural precision with the growing realization that the environment was reshaping the rules they had long relied upon. Altimeter readings and heading corrections were exchanged calmly, yet the weight of misalignment was palpable. Pilots verified each other's adjustments repeatedly, mindful that even minor deviations could escalate into catastrophic error. The aircraft's systems continued to function normally, but human interpretation of visual cues lagged behind reality. The contrast between precise instrumentation and misleading perception became increasingly stark, foreshadowing the challenges that would culminate in Flight 901's final communications. Adjustments to heading and altitude became incremental experiments, responses to terrain that appeared in unexpected locations, each one subtly altering the aircraft's relation to the intended flight corridor. Minor deviations compounded over time, resulting in a slow but measurable drift from the original path. Crew members made decisions informed by both instrument readings and fleeting glimpses of terrain, attempting to reconcile conflicting data in real time. Each correction was undertaken with care, yet the environment's deceptive simplicity rendered each adjustment simultaneously vital and precarious. The flight crew's skill was undeniable, yet the Antarctic's visual and atmospheric anomalies imposed constraints no procedure could fully account for. Instruments began registering discrepancies, alerting the crew to rising terrain where none should exist, the readings starkly contradicting the visual cues offered by the endless white expanse. Warnings from altimeters and radar were accurate, yet the surrounding landscape denied the mind an intuitive sense of urgency. The crew responded with precision, adjusting controls to maintain separation from the ice below. Yet the optical illusions remained persistent, blending ridges into the horizon and flattening the sense of space. Each alarm and alert was logged and communicated, forming a record of increasingly urgent attention, even as passengers remained oblivious to the imminent danger. The final transmissions captured a meticulous pattern of communication, repeated position reports, incremental course corrections, and calm exchanges that betrayed neither panic nor awareness of the looming danger just ahead. Recorded exchanges revealed the crew verifying altitudes, confirming headings, and noting instrument readings with careful consistency. Their voices reflected disciplined professionalism, contrasting sharply with the deceptive visual world outside. These messages, analysed after the accident, provide insight into how well-trained operators can remain methodical even when environmental conditions compromise perception. Each word, though precise, underscores the tension between the apparent serenity of the Antarctic and the hidden threats it presents. Whiteout conditions intensified as the aircraft approached the mountain range, the landscape's illusions merging sky and ice into a continuous plane, leaving every judgment and adjustment subject to unseen distortion. Peaks appeared to recede even as instruments indicated rising terrain. Shadows shifted subtly with the angle of sunlight, creating a sense of motion where none existed. The crew's reliance on visual confirmation became increasingly fraught, forcing them to depend entirely on their instruments and prior planning. Even small deviations in heading or altitude carried consequences, illustrating how fragile the distinction between safety and disaster can become in extreme environments. Radar tracks, cockpit voice recordings, and satellite imagery were pieced together, revealing a collision of human expectation, instrument guidance, and environmental deception that culminated in the aircraft's sudden disappearance from visual observation. The reconstructed path demonstrates that, despite precise navigation and effective communication, the combination of reflective surfaces, cloud interference, and human misperception created a scenario from which recovery was impossible. Every cockpit action was consistent with procedure, yet the Antarctic's deceptive clarity ensured that the aircraft's fate was sealed long before impact. Though precise transmissions persisted until the very end, the interplay between accurate reporting and flawed perception underscored the fragile boundary between operational certainty and the Antarctic's deceptive clarity. Every instrument reading and spoken correction documented a crew acting rationally within an irrationally deceptive environment. The aircraft's final moments, captured in both radar and voice recordings, form a stark reminder that even experience and procedure can be confounded when the landscape itself becomes a participant in the unfolding drama. Air New Zealand, Flight 901 entered a landscape that seemed endless and immutable, leaving only its transmissions as a haunting map of misjudgment and frozen light. South African Airways Flight 295. The Boeing 747 lifted smoothly from Johannesburg, carrying cargo and passengers across the Indian Ocean, its routine transmissions soon giving way to an unsettling record of events that would defy immediate explanation. On board, the aircraft was loaded with mail, general cargo, and several pallets designated as non-hazardous, but capable of producing significant heat under unusual conditions. Yet, beneath the veneer of a routine journey, the aircraft's environment was already shifting in imperceptible ways, setting the stage for an emergency that would challenge the crew's training and instruments alike. Crew members performed pre-flight checks with practiced precision, inspecting the cargo hold and reviewing emergency protocols, unaware that subtle indicators of potential danger were already present in the aircraft systems. Even the meticulous verification of fire suppression systems could not account for the slow, hidden ignition of materials within the cargo compartments. Engineers would later determine that certain combinations of packaging and ambient heat could create a latent hazard, invisible to the naked eye yet capable of triggering catastrophic failure. As altitude increased, instruments displayed standard readings, yet smoke detection sensors in the cargo compartment began to register irregular heat signatures, signalling the onset of an invisible threat. The flight deck's monitors indicated minor fluctuations in temperature, initially dismissed as sensor anomalies. In the cargo bay below, materials sensitive to heat started producing smoke. which slowly infiltrated ventilation channels, eventually reaching sensitive components of the aircraft's electrical systems. The aircraft's systems were designed to detect such anomalies, yet the nature of the developing fire made early interpretation and response extraordinarily difficult. The first alert arrived quietly through cockpit monitors, prompting procedural acknowledgement while offering no clear indication of the severity awaiting the crew, who responded methodically to the anomaly. The fire warning system sounded, its tone measured and unambiguous, yet it provided no detail about the exact location or potential spread. Standard checklists were consulted and followed, but the crew could not directly observe the source. Smoke, heat, and electrical interference became increasingly intertwined, forming a cascade of subtle yet significant challenges. Conversations with air traffic control reflected professional calm, each transmission measured and concise, yet analysts would later note the pattern suggested mounting concern beneath composed tones. The crew reported minor anomalies in equipment readings, confirming headings and altitudes as usual. The juxtaposition between outward composure and underlying tension underscores the unsettling nature of the aircraft's final transmissions. Smoke began to infiltrate the aircraft's systems, compromising visibility and making instruments intermittently unreliable, while the crew attempted a series of mitigative actions within the constraints of standard operating procedures. The hazard remained invisible yet pervasive, complicating judgment and forcing the crew to operate under partial information. Observers analysing the incident later emphasised how unseen environmental factors, heat, smoke and electrical disruption, interacted to create a scenario of escalating uncertainty. Attempts to adjust altitude and manage ventilation offered fleeting relief, yet the fire continued to spread within the cargo hold, unseen yet evident in subtle changes recorded by cockpit instruments. Each manoeuvre, intended to alleviate pressure or isolate systems, temporarily reduced smoke concentration and heat readings, but could not halt the underlying chemical and thermal reactions occurring below deck. The aircraft's structural integrity was unaffected initially, giving the impression of continued normalcy, yet the persistence of anomalous readings indicated that the problem was far from resolved. Crew experience and procedural knowledge were fully engaged, but the fire's concealed nature ensured that their efforts would remain insufficient. Critical systems began to fail sequentially. From electrical panels to flight controls, each malfunction documented in real time by the aircraft's final transmissions, forming a chilling chronicle of technological vulnerability. Navigation aids flickered, auxiliary power units exhibited irregularities, and communication circuits intermittently faltered. The combination of smoke, heat, and electrical stress created a compounding effect, amplifying risk and limiting the crew's ability to manage the emergency. Every cockpit entry into the flight recorders would later testify to the crew's methodical handling of a scenario that exceeded standard operational experience. Flight data and cockpit voice recordings later revealed the persistence of communication almost until the last moments, detailing course adjustments, instrument warnings, and crew dialogue that signaled both action and helplessness. The meticulous documentation of headings, altitudes, and system status reflects a disciplined response under extreme pressure. Though the final transmissions offer a chronological record of events, they also underscore the crew's inability to fully control the unfolding crisis. Analysts concluded that the consistency of the communications, coupled with growing system failures, formed a uniquely eerie testament to professional competence constrained by circumstances beyond anticipation. Search and recovery operations in the Indian Ocean revealed fragmented wreckage and partial black box recordings, illuminating some aspects of the tragedy while leaving the circumstances of the final moments largely unresolved. Debris distribution patterns suggested in-flight breakup, though the exact location of the fire origin and propagation remains debated. Salvage flight data recorders provided insight into environmental conditions, system anomalies, and crew responses, yet many questions persisted. Even with a thorough investigation, the aircraft's final communications endure as a haunting record of competence constrained by an invisible, escalating threat, a mystery encoded in measured tones and instrument readings. Every precaution, protocol, and recorded response demonstrates the crew's adherence to procedure, yet they could not overcome the concealed fire that ultimately claimed the aircraft. The lingering uncertainty renders the final transmissions simultaneously informative and profoundly unsettling, a testament to the fragility of human control in aviation emergencies. South African Airways Flight. 295 disappeared into the vast expanse of ocean and sky, leaving only its transmissions as an enigmatic testament to the unseen forces that claimed it. Aeroperú Flight 603. Darkness cloaked the Peruvian coastline as Aeroperú Flight 603 climbed, its instruments reporting readings that would silently betray the crew. The Boeing 757 lifted from Lima's Jorge Chávez International Airport in the early evening, a routine flight towards Santiago with little to suggest impending catastrophe. The night was calm, with only a thin layer of cloud hovering over the Pacific, concealing any visual reference for altitude. Crew members followed standard procedures, checking gauges and systems, unaware that a subtle obstruction on the static ports would distort every critical instrument reading. Passengers settled in for the journey, oblivious to the invisible miscommunication between aircraft and reality that had begun the moment wheels left the tarmac. In the quiet of the departure gate, meticulous checks failed to reveal a small obstruction on critical sensors, a detail that would grow into fatal confusion. Maintenance personnel had inadvertently left tape over the static ports after servicing the aircraft, and the oversight went unnoticed in the pre-flight inspection. These tiny apertures, crucial for measuring air pressure, were now sealed, sending false data to altimeters, airspeed indicators, and vertical speed indicators. The crew, trained to trust instrument data over intuition in low visibility conditions, had no reason to suspect a hidden fault. The plane's initial ascent masked the error. The readings seemed consistent until subtle anomalies began to appear. The first minutes of the flight offered a sense of normalcy, yet hidden errors in airspeed and altitude instruments quietly distorted every calculation in the cockpit. The pilots monitored the climb, noting what appeared to be correct vertical speed and heading. Fuel consumption and engine performance were within expected ranges, giving no hint of malfunction. The instruments, however, were feeding the cockpit with data entirely disconnected from reality, and the plane's increasing altitude was being interpreted incorrectly. Flight management computers, reliant on the same false inputs, offered no warnings. Every decision made, every adjustment in pitch or throttle, now rested upon a foundation of deception that was invisible to those in command. A subtle discord emerged between gauges, prompting the pilots to question what appeared trustworthy, while reality began to diverge from the cockpit displays. The captain noticed that the vertical speed indicator fluctuated unusually during level flight, while the first officer cross-checked altimeter readings against previous data. Nothing overtly suggested an emergency, yet the minute inconsistencies created unease. Small variations in airspeed reports and the perception of unexpected descent prompted repeated instrument checks, a pattern that would continue through the remainder of the flight. Each reading was technically accurate to the faulty inputs, but the disconnect between instruments and actual altitude was widening imperceptibly. Routine transmissions to Lima Control Tower carried measured headings and altitudes, masking the mounting uncertainty the crew experienced behind closed panels. From the outside, the flight seemed uneventful. Air traffic controllers received standard updates, noting no abnormal deviations. The cockpit voice recorder, however, would later reveal subtle traces of tension, brief pauses, confirmation requests, and repetition of altitude calls. The crew's calm tones concealed the growing internal struggle as they attempted to reconcile readings with memory, previous experience, and procedural training. At no point did the controllers perceive the creeping disaster. The transmissions themselves became a record of rationality under deceptive circumstances. Over the Pacific, instrument readings drifted further from reality, compelling split-second decisions based on numbers that no longer reflected the true state of flight. The altimeters indicated a level cruise, while the plane had begun a slow, unperceived descent toward the ocean. The pilots attempted minor corrections, guided by faulty vertical speed indicators and miscalibrated airspeed. Each adjustment, intended to maintain course and altitude, only compounded the problem. The aircraft's responses seemed erratic, yet the crew trusted their instruments over sensory cues, constrained by clouds and darkness. With every passing minute, the distance between the perceived flight path and the actual trajectory expanded, imperceptible to anyone monitoring from the ground. Visual cues offered little reassurance. The night sky and low clouds denied confirmation of altitude or orientation, leaving the pilots to rely on instruments that could not be trusted. Without a clear horizon, the senses of pitch, bank and speed became unreliable, and even minor adjustments carried risk. The aircraft moved smoothly, giving the impression of controlled flight, while the ocean approached beneath them. The absence of landmarks, combined with misleading instrument readings, created a tension that was invisible externally but critical internally. The crew's experience allowed them to follow standard protocols, yet the very systems they depended upon were now adversaries. The cockpit voice recorder documented a meticulous sequence of checks, adjustments and reassessments, a record of reasoning undermined by faulty data. Pilots reported headings, confirmed altitudes, and discussed minor inconsistencies, attempting to correct readings while maintaining composure. The language was technical and professional with no overt panic, yet every phrase reflected an effort to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew should be true. Later analyses would note how each transmission, precise and careful, illustrated the invisible tension between human skill and mechanical failure. These final transmissions became haunting, a record of competence challenged by unperceived deception. The wreckage revealed a hidden obstruction and its effects, showing how a single overlooked maintenance step could generate a cascade of misperceptions. Tape covering the static ports caused altimeters to read several thousand feet higher than actual altitude and led airspeed indicators to underreport velocity. Investigators reconstructed the flight path using radar and flight data, revealing a steady descent into the ocean despite the crew's belief in level flight. The findings underscored the vulnerability of human reliance on instruments and how small procedural oversights could yield catastrophic outcomes when combined with environmental conditions such as darkness and cloud cover. A convergence of human decision-making and mechanical performance highlighted the fragile interplay between judgment and reliability, underscoring how the pilot's skill and diligence were undermined by deceptive data. Aviation experts highlighted the crew's repeated verification attempts, adherence to checklists, and cross-checking of instruments. Yet, the instruments themselves had become antagonists, presenting internally consistent but externally false readings. The tragedy illustrated the limitations of training when data is fundamentally unreliable and served as a critical lesson in the necessity of rigorous maintenance verification and redundancy in flight systems. Aeroperú Flight 603 demonstrated how even skilled professionals could be misled in an environment dominated by technology. The legacy of Aeroperú Flight 603 persists in aviation safety discussions, a stark reminder that invisible errors can render every standard procedure uncertain and every decision fraught with risk. Training protocols, maintenance procedures, and design standards have all been revisited in the wake of the accident, and aviation authorities continue to cite the flight as an example of systemic vulnerability. Each investigation into cockpit voice recordings and flight data revealed the interplay of human diligence and mechanical failure, showing how the final transmissions carried both competence and confusion in equal measure. The story remains a cautionary tale of trust, perception, and the invisible forces that can transform routine flight into tragedy. The aircraft disappeared beneath clouds and waves, leaving only its recorded transmissions as an eerie testament to the perils of trusting what could not be seen. United Airlines Flight 173. The flight deck of United Airlines Flight 173 carried an unease that would later haunt investigators and pilots alike. On December 28, 1978, a McDonnell Douglas DC-8 was prepared for a routine descent into Portland International Airport, yet its final transmissions would be remembered for their calmness that belied the urgency unfolding within. Pilots discussed a suspected landing gear problem, exchanging measured, procedural dialogue as if rehearsing a checklist, but their composed voices masked a critical depletion of fuel that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. The aircraft's routine seemed ordinary until the anomaly became undeniable. Controllers in Portland received reports that were precise yet ordinary, a series of standard position and approach check-ins that suggested a smooth operation. Each transmission from the cockpit maintained professional detachment, the pilot's tones betraying no hint of panic despite the growing crisis. Ground personnel, unaware of the fuel shortage, monitored the flight with the same attention they would have given any inbound aircraft on a winter afternoon. The recordings, later scrutinized in accident reports, revealed pauses and subtle hesitations that hinted at concern but offered no explicit warning. Inside the cabin, passengers remained oblivious. The hum of the engines, the periodic announcements from the crew, and the faint rattle of luggage in overhead bins maintained an illusion of normalcy. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, completing final checks, their routines uninterrupted by the invisible thread of danger pulling taut in the cockpit. Outside, the sky over Oregon remained overcast yet forgiving, the plane slicing through clouds with an almost indifferent grace, carrying hundreds of lives toward a moment that would never be forgotten. The cockpit dialogue began with a measured discussion of the landing gear indicator light, a minor malfunction that had been noted earlier in the flight. The pilots, experienced in such technical anomalies, debated whether to circle for a visual inspection or proceed with the approach. As they deliberated, fuel gauges registered increasingly critical levels, yet the conversation remained clinical and deliberate. The contrast between the pilot's composed procedure and the creeping peril created an eerie tension, a sense that something essential was slipping beyond control despite every careful word transmitted to air traffic controllers. Air traffic control responded with standard instructions, guiding the aircraft in holding patterns while awaiting the pilot's decision. These exchanges were methodical, devoid of alarm, each phrase part of the rhythmic choreography of commercial aviation. Yet, within the cockpit, tension accumulated like storm clouds, measured not in noise or overt agitation, but in silences and repeated check-ins. Each transmission, clear and calm, concealed the gravity of the situation, offering a chilling lesson in how routine language can obscure an imminent disaster when it moves too slowly to avert tragedy. Investigators later noted that the crew's fixation on the landing gear consumed precious time, an obsession that drew attention away from monitoring fuel reserves. The recorded transmissions illustrate this focus. Discussions about hydraulic systems and light indicators extended for minutes while fuel levels dipped toward critical thresholds. The narrative embedded within those recordings is unsettling because it demonstrates how technical precision can become a perilous distraction, and how measured language can mask an approaching catastrophe that would leave both passengers and crew with no opportunity to correct course. As the minutes passed, the DC-8 remained in the holding pattern, circling above Portland with a silent mechanical persistence. The aircraft's altitude fluctuated slightly as the pilots executed maneuvers to confirm system readings. Each communication transmitted to controllers contained enough detail to reassure, yet too little to reveal the creeping danger. Even seasoned pilots reviewing the tape noted a peculiar tension in the dialogue. Phrases were professional, careful, and deliberate, yet the repetition of queries and the slight hesitations hinted at a growing uncertainty that would soon overwhelm the aircraft entirely. The final minutes in the air reveal an extraordinary tension between procedure and inevitability. The crew continued to follow established protocols for mechanical inspection, yet the fuel situation became increasingly dire. They transmitted positions and requests with calm articulation, unaware, or perhaps unable, to reconcile the discrepancy between their focus on the landing gear and the invisible threat of an empty fuel tank. These transmissions, preserved in the official records, have become a somber study in human cognition and aviation safety, where careful attention to detail could not forestall the inexorable consequences of neglecting the unseen. Portland's approach lights drew near, yet the aircraft's fuel continued to dwindle. Controllers monitored the DC-8 with the usual patience afforded to circling aircraft, unaware that each calm, factual statement from the cockpit concealed a silent countdown. The recordings exhibit no frantic pleas, no raised voices, only the persistent cadence of measured concern, a cadence that made the eventual emergency landing attempt all the more harrowing. Investigators would later describe the crew's performance as exemplary in procedure, but tragically misaligned with the aircraft's most urgent need. Moments before impact, the crew's final communications remained composed. They discussed angles of approach, gear positions, and checklist items, as if these conversations could forestall the inevitable. The disconnect between technical diligence and the looming catastrophe created a narrative that is simultaneously familiar and terrifying. Ordinary words carrying extraordinary weight, ordinary procedures entangled with extraordinary danger. The DC-8's glide path became a silent testament to the peril that can hide behind routine and to the haunting clarity of recordings that outlive the lives they chronicle. When Flight 173 finally ran out of fuel and descended uncontrollably toward the tarmac, the eerie calm of its last transmissions contrasted sharply with the chaos of the crash itself. Emergency crews arrived at a scene marked by smoke, twisted metal, and the unanswerable questions that would linger for decades. The cockpit recordings remain a chilling reminder that disasters do not always announce themselves with urgency, and that measured voices can conceal the most desperate of circumstances until there is no remaining time for intervention. The DC-8's final descent was preceded not by alarm, but by an unsettling normalcy that has since echoed in every investigation of human error and procedural fixation. The transcripts, preserved as evidence, continue to inspire reflection on how attention to minor mechanical anomalies can inadvertently obscure the gravest threats, and how the ordinary cadence of communication can carry within it the seeds of tragedy. The voices that once spoke with measured calm became a haunting testament to the fragility of certainty in the sky. Korean Airlines Flight 007. The flight had entered international airspace with the routine precision of a long-haul journey, yet its final transmissions would conceal a deadly deviation from the intended course. On September 1, 1983, a Boeing 747 departed Anchorage, Alaska, en route to Seoul, South Korea. The aircraft's crew maintained measured communication, reporting positions and altitudes with confidence. Outside, the expanse of the North Pacific seemed indifferent to the subtle errors accumulating in the cockpit, as if the sea itself waited silently for the consequences that would unfold. What appeared to be a routine crossing was already carrying the seeds of disaster. Within the cockpit, calm voices exchanged standard position reports and navigation checks, unaware that each measured word edged the aircraft closer to peril. The captain and first officer relied on inertial navigation systems, which were state-of-the-art yet prone to minute errors over long distances. Their conversation remained professional, deliberate, and confident, reflecting years of experience, while the aircraft gradually drifted from its intended route. Each transmission reassured controllers below, conveying competence even as the distance from the correct flight path widened imperceptibly. In hindsight, these conversations were haunting in their normality, the veneer of control concealing an approaching catastrophe. Ground controllers recorded the aircraft's movements with unremarkable consistency, noting headings and altitude while remaining oblivious to the subtle errors accumulating over hundreds of miles. To the operators at Japanese and Alaskan radar centers, Flight 007 was indistinguishable from any other commercial aircraft. Its position reports followed routine intervals, transmitted in clear, calm tones, yet these same transmissions would later be examined for the faintest hints of uncertainty, tiny inflections that, combined with navigational drift, revealed the catastrophic trajectory of an aircraft that had unknowingly entered restricted Soviet airspace. The ordinary cadence of flight reporting became a record of silent misdirection. Far to the north, Soviet radar operators scrutinized unfamiliar blips on their screens, recognizing an aircraft that should not have been there, yet unable to communicate its presence in time. The 747 penetrated the Kamchatka Peninsula's restricted airspace, triggering alerts in military command centers. Interceptors were scrambled, but identification and engagement protocols took precious minutes to execute. The tension within those command rooms was palpable in its quiet, calculated anticipation. Personnel tracked the aircraft methodically, observing its every maneuver, yet the pilots remained unaware, transmitting routine phrases that betrayed no hint of encroaching danger. From the outside, Flight 007 appeared ordinary, its routine exchanges masking the hidden threat created by minor navigational miscalculations. The aircraft traversed endless expanses of ocean and mountainous terrain, its enormous frame gliding through a sky seemingly unconcerned with the human drama within. Radar blips, recorded at varying stations, would later illustrate a gradual but inexorable drift, invisible to the flight crew whose confidence in their instruments and charts created a false sense of security. Even as the plane neared restricted airspace, the measured professionalism of its transmissions offered no indication of the grave peril accumulating around them. In the cockpit, small course corrections and repeated verifications betrayed no panic but hinted at growing uncertainty, imperceptible to those listening from below. The crew referenced their instruments, adjusted headings, and recalculated positions with the precision expected of seasoned aviators. A casual observer would have detected only routine diligence, yet the transcripts reveal subtle repetitions, slight pauses, and a growing focus on minor adjustments that belied their slowly diverging trajectory. These delicate clues, preserved in recordings, underscore the chilling reality that expertise and experience cannot always prevent the unseen consequences of small, incremental errors. Military personnel tracked the aircraft silently, their instruments capturing each moment while decisions remained suspended in a tense anticipation. Fighter jets vectored toward the intruder as radar operators monitored its course. The interplay between observed facts and unknown intentions created a palpable suspense, as each blip could represent either a routine incursion or the precursor to an international crisis. Yet the crew of Flight 007 continued transmitting measured communications, reporting positions and course corrections with a confidence that belied the invisible scrutiny upon them. The gap between perception and reality expanded with each passing mile. Minor hesitations in cockpit dialogue punctuated otherwise standard transmissions, each pause subtly revealing that the pilot's confidence might be misplaced. They confirmed headings, double-checked coordinates, and maintained steady communication with air traffic control, yet the pattern of repetition suggests a faint awareness of discrepancy without acknowledgement. These fleeting signs, almost imperceptible to an outsider, became critical in retrospect. They underscore how calm professionalism can obscure the danger that unfolds quietly around it, and how the veneer of normality can persist until intervention is no longer possible. Routine course confirmations and position updates flowed steadily, concealing the narrowing margin in which any corrective action could have mattered. Flight 007 maintained its altitude and heading, seemingly secure in its path. Controllers and airline operations monitored with standard diligence, unaware that the aircraft had crossed invisible thresholds into restricted zones. Each additional minute in this course compounded the consequences, and each calm phrase transmitted from the cockpit masked the fatal misalignment with reality. The juxtaposition of routine reporting and impending tragedy created a tension that would only be fully understood after the aircraft was lost. The last echoes of the aircraft on radar vanished, leaving a void that underscored the silence of the skies it once traversed. Intercepting jets, scrambled too late, observed a commercial airliner beyond reach. The last transmissions from the cockpit had been calm, professional, and measured, yet they now echo as haunting markers of a journey ended abruptly. Across international communication networks, a sudden absence replaced what had seemed like ordinary, uneventful flight reporting. That silence marked the instant where routine met catastrophe, leaving investigators and the world to confront an unsettling combination of human error and geopolitical consequence. Those investigating would later assemble fragments from radar traces, cockpit recordings, and international archives, piecing together the calm yet fatal missteps that defined its final moments. Each element, from minor navigational drift to procedural adherence, contributed to an outcome as tragic as it was preventable. Reports, audio recordings, and satellite data allowed reconstruction of the flight path, yet uncertainty remained about the exact sequence of decisions and misjudgments in the cockpit. The assembled evidence created a meticulous portrait of a tragedy in which composure and confidence were powerless against unseen forces and miscalculated assumptions. Somewhere beyond the edge of detection, the aircraft vanished into the unknown, leaving behind only echoes of certainty shattered in silence. PSA Flight 182. Midday skies stretched clear over San Diego, and PSA Flight 182's routine approach carried an ordinary rhythm that belied the seconds of impending catastrophe. The Boeing 727 descended toward Lindbergh Field, its engines humming steadily while pilots exchanged measured instructions and positional updates. The aircraft's progress seemed predictable to controllers and passengers alike, a standard descent through controlled airspace. Yet beneath the ordinary cadence, time itself seemed to compress, as the converging presence of a small Cessna 172 remained largely unnoticed. The routine chatter from the cockpit, calm and professional, would soon contrast sharply with the sudden and irreversible danger approaching from above. Within the cockpit, pilots exchanged casual remarks about traffic patterns and descent rates, their measured voices concealing the invisible narrowing of space around them. They referenced headings, cross-checked altitudes, and confirmed runway alignment, unaware that each phrase masked the encroaching threat. The first officer scanned the horizon periodically, noting other aircraft but not perceiving the Cessna directly below. Their attention remained anchored in expected procedures, emphasizing communication efficiency and situational awareness without recognizing the fatal convergence that silently approached. The normalcy of dialogue intensified the impending tension, demonstrating how routine human behavior can obscure hazards until there is no opportunity for intervention. Air traffic controllers maintained standard monitoring, issuing instructions and logging positions, while the usual calm of routine masked the approaching danger. Tower personnel observed both aircraft on radar and provided traffic advisories with professional detachment. At no point did the transmissions convey panic. Every word followed protocol and standard phrasing. In the minutes before the collision, the logs depict a series of ordinary communications, headings, altitudes, and speed adjustments that seem procedural. The contrast between the routine cadence of air traffic control and the deadly proximity of the aircraft creates a chilling reminder of how normal operations can persist even as disaster quietly unfolds. From the perspective of the small Cessna 172 ahead, the horizon seemed endless, and the crew had no awareness that the descending B727 was closing rapidly from above. The pilot and passenger observed clear skies and the distant city below, adjusting throttle and rudder in minor increments. Their dialogue remained light, noting standard navigational references and familiar terrain. There was no sign of distress, only the practiced attentiveness of a routine flight. Moments that might have appeared ordinary to those aboard the B727 or in the tower became the final fleeting seconds before two paths converged with tragic finality, the collision imminent in an expanse that otherwise appeared calm and unremarkable. Sunlight reflected off the fuselage and cockpit windows, casting patterns that momentarily distracted attention as both aircraft maneuvered through clear skies with an unspoken expectation of separation. The brilliance of the sun, high and unyielding, made visual detection challenging despite excellent visibility. Pilots relied on standard lookout procedures and instrument cross-checks, confident in separation standards. Yet, the very clarity of the day concealed the critical proximity. The juxtaposition of a perfect sunny sky with an impending mid-air collision magnifies the tragedy, highlighting how ordinary conditions and routine operations can mask hazards that are otherwise unavoidable once paths converge. Split-second glances, subtle corrections, and repeated scans of the surrounding airspace hinted at awareness without alarm, the pilot's perception unfolding too slowly against the speed of convergence. Each adjustment, each minute observation, occurred as though time itself slowed, yet the Cessna and B727 were already within critical range. Instruments provided accurate readings, but visual judgment lagged behind the rapid closing distance. The tension lies in the contrast. Everything was procedurally correct, yet entirely insufficient. These final seconds demonstrate the fragility of human perception and the limits of training when confronted with sudden, spatially complex threats that emerge faster than any corrective response can be executed. Chatter over the cockpit radios increased only slightly in focus, a repetition of headings and traffic calls, none conveying the magnitude of the collision about to occur. The crew mentioned other aircraft, adjusted flaps, and verified descent rate with routine precision. Controllers responded with brevity and professionalism, neither aware of the exact positions nor of the speed at which the B727 approached the Cessna. The ordinary cadence of conversation amplified the eeriness of the situation. Measured words, calm voices, and procedural focus coexisting with an imminent catastrophe. Within these exchanges, the invisible tension builds, a silent narrative of inevitability unfolding against the backdrop of routine operations in a deceptively clear sky. Seconds collapsed into inevitability as the aircraft approached one another, the careful choreography of airspace awareness disrupted by slight misjudgments and the limits of human observation. Pilots of both aircraft adjusted as best they could, but visual separation failed. The exact moments before impact contained brief alarms, instrument indications, and sudden realizations of proximity that arrived far too late. The collision occurred in an instant, transforming ordered flight paths into chaos. Sound, vibration, and the shattering of the fuselage marked the abrupt transition from ordinary procedure to irreversible disaster, illustrating how unpredictability can invade even the most routine and controlled environment. Instruments rattled, warning lights flashed, and the suddenness of impact overwhelmed both crews, converting calm routine into instantaneous chaos in the sky. Structural integrity failed in moments, and both aircraft became entangled in the physics of collision. The B-727's crew attempted evasive action even as control surfaces responded unpredictably. Every second was filled with sensory overload, alarms, visual disorientation, and the sudden awareness that standard flight procedures were no longer sufficient to prevent catastrophe. The juxtaposition of ordinary communications with instantaneous destruction underscores the fragility of human expectation in a system where even minor lapses can yield fatal consequences. Ground radar, tower logs, and emergency communications captured fragments of the moment, juxtaposing the earlier serenity of normal flight with the abrupt, violent disruption. Tower personnel observed blips vanish, alarms sounded, and controllers struggled to comprehend the sequence unfolding. Emergency response coordination began instantly, yet the calmness of prior transmissions amplified the shock. Fragments of cockpit voice recordings later revealed casual chatter moments before the collision, emphasizing how ordinary dialogue masked extraordinary danger. The contrast between procedural normality and abrupt chaos becomes a haunting lesson in how everyday operations can harbor moments of irretrievable disaster, when timing and perception collide. The sequence of final exchanges revealed how ordinary procedural language had concealed the critical proximity that ended in mid-air collision, leaving a scene of confusion and loss. Radar traces, audio logs, and eyewitness accounts allowed analysts to recreate the final trajectory, highlighting the fleeting decisions and perceptual limits that contributed to the tragedy. The meticulous, ordinary routine of flight and air traffic control offers a chilling backdrop against which the fatal convergence occurred. Even now, the transcripts of measured communication linger as a stark reminder of how quickly normalcy can be shattered in moments when human perception and procedural expectation fail simultaneously. In the expanse of clear blue sky, a fleeting lapse in perception proved that even the most ordinary day can conceal the sharp edge of disaster. Colgan Air Flight 3407. A winter haze hung over Buffalo, New York as Colgan Air Flight 3407 began its final descent, its ordinary transmissions masking the subtle onset of danger in the icy air. The Dash 8, 400 aircraft followed standard approach procedures, the crew methodically checking instruments and confirming altitudes as snow streaked across the runway lights. Passengers felt only the normal hum of engines and the gentle vibration of the airframe over frigid air. Outside, the low clouds and swirling ice created a deceptive calm, as though the landscape itself were holding its breath while unseen forces slowly tilted routine into peril. Inside the cockpit, pilots exchanged routine approach checks and altitude confirmations, their voices steady despite the bite of freezing temperatures and the faint rattle of ice on the windshield. They monitored instruments and navigation aids, referencing charts and autopilot settings with habitual precision. Flap settings were adjusted, landing gear verified, and approach vectors repeated aloud. Each verbal confirmation reinforced normalcy, masking the growing uncertainty caused by environmental factors. While the pilots maintained professional composure, subtle anomalies, slightly slower response to control inputs and minor instrument variations, hinted at the challenges gathering unseen outside their field of vision. Air traffic controllers followed the aircraft with routine vigilance, issuing instructions and logging altitude, unaware that the winter conditions and slight deviations were quietly stacking toward catastrophe. The controllers tracked both Colgan Air Flight 3407 and other traffic in the Buffalo approach pattern, coordinating landings with procedural calm. Instructions for descent, heading adjustments, and speed modifications flowed without urgency. To them, all appeared routine, yet the combination of environmental hazards and minor in-flight deviations was not immediately apparent on radar or voice logs. What began as ordinary procedural communication would soon conceal a rapidly escalating crisis. Snow swept across the horizon in thin, swirling ribbons, limiting visual cues and challenging the crew's perception, even as instruments appeared nominal and the approach remained on schedule. Visibility remained within operational minima, yet the interplay of reflection, glare, and drifting snow reduced depth perception and subtly distorted the runway environment. Pilots relied on familiar reference points, scanning the horizon and approach lights repeatedly. The rhythmic repetition of checks and visual confirmation created a sense of security that belied the aerodynamic uncertainties building around them. The ordinary winter scene became a quiet adversary, slowly asserting its influence over the aircraft's handling. Subtle discrepancies flickered across the dashboard, minor stall alerts, small control feedback irregularities, and readings that suggested the plane was responding slightly differently than expected. The autopilot and manual controls behaved inconsistently under the accumulating ice load, though the crew interpreted each signal as manageable within standard operational parameters. Adjustments were made carefully, each correction measured, maintaining a tone of calm dialogue over the radios. Small vibrations, slight pitch changes, and repetitive instrument calls hinted at instability that was not yet critical. These imperceptible cues, unnoticed by passengers and controllers, foreshadowed the rapid escalation that would follow. The wind intensified as the aircraft passed through scattered clouds, buffeting the fuselage and increasing the cognitive load on the pilots, who continued routine dialogue as though all was normal. Engine power adjustments, flap checks, and heading confirmations flowed steadily despite the subtle perturbations in airspeed and angle of attack. Visual reference points occasionally disappeared behind swirls of icy precipitation, forcing reliance on instruments. The crew maintained their measured cadence, focusing on procedural tasks while environmental stress quietly compounded. In these moments, the tension was almost invisible, carried in the tactile feedback of controls and the quiet mental calculations occurring beyond the spoken words. A sudden tremor under the controls indicated the first true onset of aerodynamic stall, prompting immediate adjustments that were measured but increasingly desperate in tone. Warning lights illuminated, alerting pilots to the critical angle of attack, yet their initial response was methodical, reflecting training and habit. Flap and throttle corrections were applied in rapid succession, yet the icy conditions and subtle airframe anomalies slowed the aircraft's response. Each second of hesitation increased the challenge, compressing time as a quiet storm of aerodynamic forces overtook the structured routine of approach. The calm, controlled dialogue now contrasted sharply with the escalating physical reality of the aircraft's condition. Controllers noticed slight deviations from the projected approach path and attempted to confirm altitude and heading, but the rapid sequence of events had already begun to overwhelm both crew and instruments. Radio's exchanges remained professional but increasingly fragmented, as small misalignments and unexpected pitch variations demanded the pilot's immediate attention. The aircraft's descent became irregular, producing minor oscillations in vertical speed and trajectory that were perceptible on radar, yet hard to interpret in real time. These incremental anomalies, unnoticed until the final seconds, illustrate how quickly a routine operation can become irretrievably precarious when environmental and mechanical stresses converge. The aircraft shuddered and pitched unpredictably, spinning gently as the pilots fought to regain control, their voice transmissions fragmenting into repeated confirmations and brief exclamations. Instruments warned of critical parameters, flaps and throttles responded sluggishly under ice-laden surfaces, and the familiar rhythm of approach checks broke down. The tactile feedback through the yoke and rudder pedals conveyed instability, yet cognitive processing lagged behind the aircraft's motions. Passengers felt the sudden turbulence as an unsettling vibration, entirely unlike the smooth descent expected moments before. The growing dissonance between perception and reality foreshadowed the final fatal moments. Each second accelerated the descent, and the surrounding winter landscape rushed upward with terrifying inevitability, as the calm of earlier transmissions contrasted starkly with the growing chaos. The fuselage vibrated, and altitude dropped rapidly despite corrective inputs. The windshield displayed a blur of snow, lights and ground features moving at alarming speed. The structured cadence of previous cockpit chatter was now fractured into short, urgent phrases, yet the aircraft's momentum toward impact was unstoppable. The ordinary flight routine, once reassuring, had become an ineffective shield against the compounding effects of weather, stall, and rapid loss of control. Fragments of cockpit recordings, flight data, and weather observations slowly revealed the sequence of subtle missteps and environmental challenges that had quietly escalated into disaster. Analysis of the Dash 8 400's final moments shows that professional procedure and measured communication had concealed the onset of aerodynamic instability. Environmental forces, ice accumulation, wind gusts, and low temperatures interacted with minor deviations and delayed reactions to amplify the aircraft's loss of control. The juxtaposition of ordinary transmissions and silent hazards underscores the fragile boundary between routine and catastrophe in aviation, where even brief lapses or misperceptions can have irreversible consequences. In the icy stillness above Buffalo, the ordinary cadence of flight hid a sudden unravelling, leaving only unanswered questions in its wake. TWA Flight 800. TWA. Flight 800 maintained a steady course over the Atlantic, its ordinary transmissions conveying calm routine even as unseen forces would soon rend that normalcy apart. Engines hummed with the steady rhythm of the long-range flight, and the autopilot guided the aircraft along a smooth trajectory toward its destination. Pilots monitored systems, checked altitudes, and confirmed navigation with practiced composure. From the outside, the plane appeared serene against the expansive ocean and sky, a giant in motion without a hint of the imminent catastrophe that would shatter the ordered patterns of the routine cruise. The final calm of this flight would prove hauntingly brief. Pilots monitored instruments and autopilot settings, exchanging standard updates on altitude and course, their voices composed and professional in the quiet hum of high-altitude flight. Each system appeared nominal, fuel flow, engine performance, and electrical and hydraulic pressures remained within standard ranges. Routine checklist confirmations punctuated the otherwise silent cabin, emphasizing procedural normality. Occasionally minor turbulence was noted and compensated for with subtle adjustments, leaving no indication of danger. The crew's focus on consistency, procedure, and communication reinforced the impression of a perfectly ordinary flight, masking the invisible accumulation of forces that would abruptly tear through that veneer of stability. In the cabin, passengers sipped beverages and conversed softly, oblivious to the fragile equilibrium of the aircraft and the atmosphere surrounding them at 30,000 feet. Children played quietly, flight attendants moved along aisles with measured calm, and the hum of the engines blended with gentle background chatter. The vastness of the Atlantic stretched endlessly beyond windows, its dark surface reflecting distant cloud cover and glimmers of light from the horizon. This ordinary mid-air tableau contrasted sharply with the abrupt violence about to erupt, a reminder of how sudden catastrophe can intrude on even the most unremarkable, meticulously controlled routine. Clouds stretched below and around the plane in shifting layers, light from the horizon casting subtle reflections across the fuselage, while the wind at altitude whispered only in gentle vibrations. The sky alternated between pale luminescence and muted grey, and the sun's reflection occasionally glinted off wing surfaces. The thin atmosphere carried faint hums from engines and airflow over the fuselage, almost imperceptible to the human ear. Amid this quiet, the aircraft's enormous mass moved predictably, yet the very perfection of routine made the sudden eruption all the more jarring. Environmental conditions seemed calm, yet the unseen internal dynamics of the plane were primed for abrupt disruption. Instruments flickered with minor anomalies, brief irregularities that passed unnoticed amidst routine checklists and confirmations, leaving no hint that these signals presaged the abrupt rupture to come. Small voltage variations, momentary pressure fluctuations, or faint warnings could have gone unremarked. Pilots relied on cross-verification and contextual judgment, dismissing minor irregularities as inconsequential. Even as minor deviations occurred, they were absorbed into normal procedural behaviour, illustrating the narrow margin between ordinary operation and disaster. These quiet, fleeting cues, imperceptible to casual observation, hinted at the fragile balance that would vanish in an instant, Without warning, a violent shudder coursed through the aircraft, followed by sudden structural stress and an explosion that transformed calm cruise into chaos in a heartbeat. The cabin shook, lights flickered, and a deafening concussive force rippled through the fuselage. Passengers were thrown from their seats and objects were scattered as the sound of ripping metal filled the cabin. The autopilot disengaged instantly, and instruments spiked with readings no pilot had ever rehearsed. Time itself seemed to stretch as the suddenness of destruction overtook the ordinary cadence of flight, leaving human perception struggling to process the abrupt violation of expectations. Fragmented communications erupted from the cockpit, voice transmissions splitting into hurried calls, alarm responses, and attempts to regain control even as systems failed in rapid succession. Pilots shouted brief confirmations, repeated emergency checklists, and attempted to stabilize a plane that was simultaneously twisting, shuddering, and losing structural integrity. Controls responded unpredictably, and the familiar rhythm of procedural responses became a cacophony of urgent exclamations and short phrases. The contrast between calm cruise and instantaneous chaos highlighted the sudden, uncontrollable nature of the event, reinforcing how swiftly normalcy could be obliterated in the sky. Radar screens below flickered as the aircraft's blip disappeared, and controllers struggled to interpret the instantaneous cessation of all transmissions from a flight that had been uneventful moments earlier. Ground personnel watched incomprehensible gaps appear in tracking data, while emergency protocols were activated in real time. No warning had preceded the disappearance. No sequence of escalating anomalies allowed preparation. To those on the ground, the aircraft vanished almost as if it had been erased from the sky, leaving only fragments of voice and telemetry to mark its final moments. The sudden silence reinforced the unsettling mystery of what had occurred. Panels glowed erratically, autopilot disengaged, and the fuselage vibrated with a force that no procedure could mitigate, while passengers and crew alike were caught in the surreal immediacy of disaster. Instruments indicated impossible readings, alarms sounded simultaneously, and structural stress became tangible to anyone observing. The surreal environment, light flashing, metal groaning, and uncontrolled motion, rendered familiar cockpit procedures partially irrelevant. Even highly trained professionals were forced to act instinctively against forces beyond comprehension. The sensory and technical assault underscored the extraordinary and instantaneous rupture of an otherwise routine flight. Each second accelerated the sequence of destruction, instruments and controls becoming unreliable, and the horizon below rushing upward with unrelenting inevitability as the aircraft succumbed to forces beyond immediate comprehension. The Boeing 747 descended in an uncontrolled arc, metal and systems failing in rapid succession. Cabin objects, passengers, and crew were subjected to extreme forces, and sensory input overwhelmed the ability to process events linearly. Every familiar rhythm of flight, engine hum, autopilot engagement, instrument readouts, had been replaced by a chaotic cascade of warnings, vibrations, and structural instability. The ordinary routine of long-range cruise had been replaced entirely by instantaneous catastrophe. Through careful review of cockpit voice recordings, flight data, and eyewitness accounts, only fragments of ordinary routine were revealed, shattered instantaneously, emphasizing how swiftly life at cruise altitude could turn unknowable. Analysts noted that standard cruise communications, autopilot readings, and minor procedural checks preceded an event of overwhelming magnitude. Environmental conditions, fuel distribution, and aircraft configuration were documented, yet the precise ignition source remained debated. The juxtaposition of calm procedure against instantaneous destruction highlights the fragility of human expectation and the abrupt, sometimes inexplicable nature of aviation catastrophe. After the blast, the ordinary cadence of flight vanished, leaving only the vast Atlantic and a lingering unanswered question of what had occurred. Air Flight 1285. Dawn spread across the tarmac at Gander, Newfoundland, as Air Flight 1285 prepared for takeoff, its routine communications masking the fragile moments before catastrophe. The early morning light reflected faintly off frost-specked wings and the runway surface, creating a deceptive sense of calm. Engines rumbled quietly as ground personnel completed final inspections, and the crew inside the cockpit followed standard pre-flight procedures. Passengers, military personnel returning from overseas assignments, moved about the cabin in muted anticipation. From the outside, everything seemed ordinary, yet the ordinary was about to vanish in the first minutes of ascent. In the cockpit, pilots ran through final checks, monitoring gauges, engine readings, and control surfaces with practiced calm as the ground crew completed their last inspections. The captain verified throttle response and control feedback, while the first officer confirmed flap positions, landing gear locks, and instrument calibration. The crew exchanged brief confirmations, acknowledging standard readings and noting no abnormalities. Autopilot and navigation systems were armed for departure, and checklists were signed off with meticulous precision. Each movement and spoken confirmation reinforced routine, projecting a calm that belied the vulnerability inherent in the moments just before leaving solid ground. Air traffic controllers observed the aircraft taxi with measured attention, issuing takeoff clearance and logging headings and altitudes in the quiet of early morning operations. The controllers tracked nearby traffic, weather reports and runway conditions, yet nothing indicated the impending disaster. Departure instructions were standard, acknowledging the heavy DC-8 fully loaded with personnel and cargo. Radar blips moved predictably along pre-assigned corridors, and the early morning calm suggested a smooth departure ahead. To those monitoring from the ground, the aircraft's movement remained entirely unremarkable, its transmissions routine, and its climb path expected to follow standard procedure. Runway lights glimmered through thin mist, engines hummed softly, and the low winter sun reflected off fuselage panels, setting a deceptively ordinary stage for flight. Frost clung to the tarmac, glinting in the muted light, while distant hills framed the horizon with icy stillness. The weight of the aircraft pressed against its tyres, the engines vibrating as thrust gradually increased. Flight attendants completed their checks, and passengers adjusted to the gentle movement of taxiing. Each element of the pre-liftoff procedure projected control and predictability, concealing the narrow margin in which disaster could arise with minimal warning. The DC-8 accelerated down the asphalt strip, tyres gripping the runway while vibrations coursed through the airframe, each increment in speed confirmed by routine cockpit dialogue. Pilots monitored engine response, noting RPM, fuel flow, and airspeed while subtly adjusting rudder and yoke. The nose lifted fractionally in anticipation of rotation, and instruments indicated proper alignment with the center line. The aircraft's momentum built steadily, a controlled force that would soon be interrupted. Every check, every readout reinforced the sense of routine, and yet the engines and airframe responded to conditions unseen by either crew or ground personnel, setting the stage for the abrupt, fatal deviation. Wheels lifted cleanly from the ground, and the climb began, the nose rising steadily as pilots maintained calm updates on airspeed, pitch, and engine performance. The early morning mist thinned, revealing icy patches of runway far below, while the engine's roar filled the cabin with an ordinary sense of power. Controls felt responsive, instruments were within normal parameters, and autopilot engaged without incident. Passengers pressed lightly against their seats as the plane ascended, unaware that this ordinary climb was the last time routine would dominate. For the brief moments above Newfoundland, everything appeared as it should, masking the latent instability that would follow. Small fluctuations appeared in engine readings, briefly noted and dismissed by the crew as normal variations, leaving the subtle warning signals unnoticed against the rhythm of ascent. RPM variations and minor control feedback deviations were recorded but interpreted as negligible. Flaps and trim positions remained nominal, and visual observations of the wings and horizon suggested no cause for concern. The crew continued routine calls, reporting altitudes and speeds to air traffic control, their focus absorbed by standard procedure. The imperceptible anomalies represented only a faint whisper of instability, too subtle to indicate the sudden, rapid escalation that would arrive within seconds. Controllers confirmed the departure, noting altitude and course with routine brevity, unaware that the aircraft's final transmissions would soon cease without explanation. Radar blips tracked a steady climb, and clearances were acknowledged in measured tones. The normal cadence of departure reinforced the expectation that the aircraft remained under complete control. Ground personnel observed the smooth ascent through binoculars and radar readouts, perceiving nothing unusual. In these fleeting moments, The brief equilibrium of flight persisted, yet beneath the surface, mechanical and environmental factors were already converging toward the event that would terminate all communications. Moments after liftoff, vibrations intensified, and control responses became irregular, cockpit chatter fragmenting as the aircraft began a rapid, uncontrollable departure from the expected climb path. The fuselage shuddered, and minor alarms sounded as pilots attempted corrective inputs, struggling to regain expected control. Instruments fluctuated, indicating unstable thrust and lift. While airflow over wings produced unexpected responses, the passengers felt the subtle disorienting vibrations, contrasting sharply with the calm from seconds earlier. The aircraft's trajectory diverged abruptly from expectation, compressing seconds into a sequence of uncontrollable events that would culminate in immediate disaster. The DC-8's trajectory faltered, instruments spiked, and mechanical instability compounded, culminating in the sudden collapse that ended its ascent within seconds. Engine performance declined, lift was compromised, and structural stress increased exponentially as the plane dropped toward the terrain below. Crew's attempts to stabilize the flight proved insufficient, controls responding imperfectly or not at all. The momentary normalcy that had accompanied liftoff evaporated completely. Passengers and crew experienced a terrifying sequence compressed into seconds, and all preceding calm transmissions became an eerie contrast to the sudden, final, fatal descent. Data recovered later, including fragments of voice transmissions and radar logs, revealed how ordinary, uneventful exchanges had concealed the final, fatal seconds of a flight cut tragically short. Analysis confirmed that routine acknowledgements and minor procedural notes had been the aircraft's last communications, preserving a veneer of calm even as disaster unfolded. The brief flight, its fleeting transmissions, and sudden cessation underscored the fragility of human expectation in aviation, where a standard takeoff can be abruptly transformed into catastrophe by factors imperceptible in the moment. In the fleeting minutes above Newfoundland, normal routine evaporated, leaving only silence and the lingering uncertainty of what had truly occurred. EgyptAir Flight 574. The pilots of EgyptAir Flight 574 studied the instrument panels with meticulous care, confirming autopilot engagement and verifying heading as the flight settled into routine cruising parameters. The Boeing 737-400, carrying passengers and crew across Indonesian airspace, maintained level flight over the Sulawesi Sea. Autopilot systems indicated normal operation, and minor fluctuations in engine readings went unnoticed amid procedural checks. Crew exchanges were calm, professional, and methodical, reflecting standard operating routines. Despite the outward sense of control, subtle irregularities in navigation had begun, leaving the first seeds of unease buried beneath the normal cadence of cockpit conversation. Minor discrepancies flickered across the navigation display, brief enough to pass unnoticed amid calm conversation about expected waypoints and fuel consumption. The first officer noted a slight delay in GPS position updates, a hesitation easily dismissed as a momentary signal lag. The captain confirmed altitude and speed, making minor adjustments without concern. Autopilot continued to guide the aircraft smoothly along its course, masking the creeping divergence from the intended flight path. The subtle mismatch between perceived and actual position over the vast featureless ocean remained imperceptible, and the calm dialogue between pilots reinforced the appearance of normalcy. The first officer adjusted the control yoke subtly, aligning the aircraft with the programmed course, while the captain monitored engine responses and autopilot readings without alarm. Small corrections in the heading were made seamlessly, instruments confirming stability. Clouds drifted across the horizon, sunlight reflected faintly off the waves, and the subtle environmental cues provided no reason for concern. The crew's attention remained on cockpit instruments, cross-checking data, and confirming system performance. Even as the aircraft deviated slowly, the autopilot compensated effortlessly, maintaining a trajectory that seemed precise but quietly concealed an underlying misalignment. Cockpit dialogue remained measured and professional, touching on course verification, minor heading corrections, and system status updates that seemed routine but were gradually accumulating tension. Reassurances were exchanged regarding the autopilot and inertial navigation systems, Yet the subtle inconsistencies persisted. The pilots' voices projected calm competence, contrasting with the faint but mounting irregularities in instrument readings. Every acknowledgement and repeated verification reinforced the normality of flight, creating a veneer of control that masked the slow drift from the assigned course over the open sea. Subtle shifts in the aircraft's trajectory went largely undetected at first, autopilot compensating smoothly, yet masking the slow divergence from the intended route. The 737 continued along a line that appeared correct on cockpit displays, but minute deviations had begun to accumulate. The captain adjusted trim settings lightly, believing they were minor corrections to expected deviations. Beneath the calm surface of autopilot-guided flight, the interplay of minor errors and environmental factors was quietly steering the aircraft toward a path increasingly misaligned with its intended course. Conflicting GPS and inertial navigation readings drew repeated glances, autopilot disengaging intermittently, requiring careful manual input that kept the pilots aware but not yet alarmed. The instruments presented contradictory data. Heading seemed correct according to the inertial navigation, but the GPS suggested a slight offset. Each correction required cross-checking, creating a subtle tension that threaded through the calm cockpit conversation. Though the pilots remained composed, the airframe's true position over the sea was slowly diverging, a hidden narrative unnoticed, until the sum of small discrepancies could no longer be reconciled. Instruments and visual cues clashed as cloud cover and fading light created deceptive horizons, challenging the pilot's spatial awareness in ways that could not be corrected by sight alone. The flat, featureless sea and scattered clouds made judging tilt and bank difficult, forcing reliance on imperfect instruments. Minor tilts went unnoticed at first, and the autopilot's intermittent corrections disguised the growing instability. The interplay of sensory perception and technical readings created subtle disorientation, gradually eroding the pilot's ability to intuitively gauge the aircraft's attitude relative to the horizon. Cockpit communications began fragmenting into short acknowledgements, minor alerts, and caution lights appearing sporadically as the crew attempted to reconcile system readings with perceived level flight. Repeated confirmations punctuated the silence, each acknowledgement reflecting growing uncertainty. Small warnings blinked momentarily on displays, and the pilots made cautious adjustments, yet the overall flight trajectory continued to diverge imperceptibly. Calm dialogue persisted, but tension accumulated in the background as the gradual misalignment of instruments and reality compounded, leaving the crew increasingly reliant on instruments that were already giving inconsistent data. The aircraft developed a gradual but noticeable bank, rolling subtly before the tilt became more pronounced, signalling the initial stages of an uncontrolled spiral. The pilots attempted corrective inputs, but the interplay of instrument confusion and spatial disorientation made precise adjustments increasingly difficult. The autopilot had disengaged, leaving control entirely to the crew. Each moment extended the sequence of slow, escalating instability, as calm conversations about routine systems became fragmented and infrequent. The first signs of uncorrectable flight deviation emerged, visible only through subtle shifts in the artificial horizon and instrument readings. Descent accelerated, controls responded inconsistently, and the crew's final transmissions were terse fragments, capturing the collapse of control over the Sulawesi Sea in its last moments. The 737 tilted further, rolling and pitching irregularly, its trajectory no longer predictable. Alarms sounded intermittently, but the pace of the aircraft's descent outstripped any corrective measures. The crew's voice, once measured and professional, was now reduced to disjointed statements, fragments of acknowledgement that the final moments had arrived with near-silent inevitability. Combining flight data with recovered voice recordings revealed that calm conversation and routine procedure had hidden a creeping loss of orientation, documenting the slow progression to fatality. Analysts noted that the autopilot's compensations had initially masked the subtle drift, while minor instrument discrepancies compounded over minutes. The serene tone of cockpit communication contrasted starkly with the growing instability, revealing how ordinary methodical exchanges had concealed the descent into the ocean. In the end, the aircraft's final transmissions were brief, unremarkable, and haunting in their normalcy. The Sulawesi Sea consumed the aircraft in silence, leaving only the unspoken tension of its spiralling descent. Aeroflot Flight 593. The captain's eyes moved rapidly across the navigation panel, tracing subtle shifts in the gauges while autopilot adjustments seemed slightly out of sync with expectations. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Altitude, speed and heading were stable, and routine checklists were being completed without incident. Yet hidden within the calm procedure was a creeping irregularity, imperceptible to air traffic control or passengers, that would soon unravel the sequence of control the crew had relied upon for years. Each flicker on a display hinted at an unseen disturbance, a silent prelude to events that would challenge both instruments and human perception. The first officer noticed a brief flicker on the flight display, a minor anomaly that went unspoken as routine checks continued, masking a growing undercurrent of uncertainty. He adjusted his focus between the artificial horizon and the navigation instruments, double-checking each reading against memory and training. Though the flight was over Siberian terrain, clouds and atmospheric conditions offered no apparent explanation for the slight variations. Neither pilot could yet pinpoint a source, and the autopilot seemed to compensate automatically, offering reassurance even as the seeds of disorientation were being sown in the cockpit. Training and procedure guided every motion, yet the juxtaposition of calm technique and instrument inconsistency planted a quiet tension in the cockpit air. Years of experience conditioned both pilots to trust standard protocols, but the subtle anomalies created a growing cognitive dissonance. The aircraft's response sometimes contradicted expectations, and even small corrections required heightened attention. The crew's dialogue remained professional, methodical, and devoid of alarm, preserving the facade of normalcy. Outside the cockpit, passengers continued their routines, unaware that the smooth hum of engines masked an invisible deviation, slowly complicating the act of flight. Slight hesitations in control inputs were dismissed initially, but repeated minor deviations prompted cross-checks and careful recalibrations by both pilots. The yaw indicator wavered briefly, and autopilot corrections produced minor, unexpected counter-movements. Each adjustment, seemingly inconsequential, added to the subtle dissonance, and the pilots relied heavily on instrument verification to confirm stability. Their voices maintained an even tone, not indicating internal concern, yet their hands lingered slightly longer on the controls, compensating unconsciously for inconsistencies that suggested an outside influence, imperceptible yet increasingly significant. An unperceived presence in the cockpit introduced small, unpredictable fluctuations, subtle enough to evade immediate detection, yet enough to compound the pilot's mounting confusion. The intrusion itself was minor. A passenger had reached the controls momentarily, their curiosity triggering inputs that would distort autopilot responses and instrument feedback. The crew remained unaware of the source, attributing deviations to atmospheric turbulence or system error. As the flight progressed, these small human-induced discrepancies grew, each unnoticed nudge layering atop the next, slowly pushing the aircraft away from its intended attitude and introducing a hidden thread of instability that would prove fatal. Communication became clipped and fragmented as the crew attempted to reconcile conflicting readings, each acknowledgement revealing the increasing cognitive load under unusual conditions. "Altitude check," the captain muttered, then paused, scanning the panel again. "All within limits," came the first officer's response, though the hesitancy was audible. Short phrases replaced longer procedural dialogue, reflecting mental efforts spent deciphering what instruments now failed to convey reliably. Autopilot adjustments lagged or contradicted manual inputs, and each corrective maneuver revealed yet another inconsistency. The calm, professional cadence of conversation contrasted sharply with the underlying sense of unexplainable interference. Roll indicators and autopilot outputs conflicted, forcing repeated manual adjustments that magnified disorientation and left the aircraft subtly off its intended trajectory. The captain attempted minor corrections to bank and pitch, but the inputs did not produce the expected outcomes. The autopilot remained partially engaged, responding unpredictably to the combined human and automated controls. Minute course deviations began to accumulate, creating a slow but perceptible drift. Though the aircraft remained well within safe parameters externally, internally, the cockpit became a theatre of subtle chaos. where every instrument blinked with uncertainty and every movement carried potential consequence. The gradual onset of instability unfolded beneath the crew's procedural calm, a chain reaction of unnoticed errors amplified by human interference. Data recovered from the flight recorders indicated that multiple small deviations coincided with the period when unauthorized cockpit input occurred. Each anomaly was insufficient alone to trigger alarms or corrective warnings, but their cumulative effect slowly eroded situational control. What seemed like ordinary operational noise, a brief hesitation, a minor correction, was in fact a hidden narrative of compounding uncertainty that would culminate in loss of control. Sensory perception clashed with instrument feedback, the horizon offering little guidance as the aircraft slowly began to tilt and bank in unanticipated ways. The pilot's eyes darted between dials and the external view, attempting to reconcile physical sensation with conflicting numerical data. Slight lateral tilts and yaw movements, imperceptible to anyone else on board, contributed to a subtle but growing disorientation. Each adjustment made to counteract perceived drift introduced further inconsistency, while the autopilot's partial intervention only added layers of unpredictability. In a matter of minutes, an initially imperceptible instability evolved into a fully fledged challenge to human cognition and reaction. Final transmissions were brief, interrupted, and ultimately ceased as the plane's response to cumulative interference and minor procedural anomalies reached a tipping point. Cockpit voice recordings captured fragmented statements, acknowledgements, corrections, and a rising tension in tone, all indicating attempts to recover an aircraft that was gradually slipping beyond full control. No external parties could interpret the subtle human error compounded by instrument inconsistency. Only the internal voices reveal the struggle to maintain flight integrity. These last moments, seemingly ordinary in conversation, contrasted with the extraordinary consequences of a quiet, escalating anomaly. A review of events revealed that ordinary conversation and standard procedure had masked a slowly unfolding disaster, initiated by a single, brief intrusion and amplified by human error. Pilots followed protocols to the letter, instruments functioned correctly within expected tolerances, and yet the aircraft's trajectory had subtly shifted beyond recoverable limits. Investigators concluded that a combination of unnoticed cockpit interference and delayed recognition of minor anomalies created a perfect storm, invisible until it was too late. The unsettling reality was that the final transmissions captured routine dialogue, even as control was quietly, inexorably lost. Over Siberia, the aircraft was lost, leaving only the haunting puzzle of how a brief intrusion could unravel an entire flight. SilkAir Flight 185. Routine cruise altitude offered an illusion of safety, yet cockpit recordings would later reveal the first hints of a sudden, unexplained disruption. The aircraft had departed from Jakarta earlier that evening en route to Singapore, and for the first hour everything proceeded according to plan. The engines hummed steadily, autopilot maintained course, and cabin service continued with quiet efficiency. Passengers read or dozed, none suspecting the anomaly beginning to form within the cockpit. On the instrument panel, minor fluctuations appeared sporadically, subtle enough to be dismissed, yet, in hindsight, these fleeting discrepancies marked the opening act of an event that would remain profoundly mysterious. Panels displayed normal readings, and the pilot's hands moved with practiced ease, masking the subtle irregularities flickering across the instruments. The captain performed routine system checks, verifying engine performance, fuel consumption, and navigational alignment. The first officer confirmed altitude and heading, a calm exchange that belied the instrument's occasional, almost imperceptible hesitation. Autopilot remained engaged, adjusting continuously with smooth efficiency. To anyone observing externally, the flight appeared ordinary. Yet behind the cockpit doors, slight inconsistencies suggested the early stages of deviation, a quiet anomaly that would grow faster than any standard procedure could contain. As passengers adjusted seatbelts and reading lights, they remained unaware that the gentle hum of the cabin hid the onset of an invisible anomaly. Flight attendants moved quietly down the aisle, offering drinks and attending to small requests, each step marking the normalcy that contrasted sharply with what would soon unfold. Some passengers leaned toward windows, noting clouds drifting past, while others focused on books or screens. There was no turbulence, no warning signs beyond what instruments would later reveal. The calm exterior of the aircraft masks the subtle, almost imperceptible events in the cockpit, where minute discrepancies were already beginning to accumulate into a pattern that defied explanation. Minor deviations in altitude appeared for seconds at a time, prompting quick verification, but nothing suggested a threat beyond ordinary turbulence. The pilots cross-checked readings, recalibrated instruments, and scanned the horizon for visual cues, yet each adjustment seemed to produce only fleeting stability. The altimeter ticked inconsistently, yaw indicators shifted slightly, and heading adjustments were sometimes delayed by a fraction of a second. To the trained eye, these anomalies were detectable, but their imperceptibility under normal circumstances allowed the initial phase of disturbance to remain unnoticed. Every decision remained procedural, every adjustment routine, yet the aircraft had begun an unseen journey away from complete control. Abruptly, the aircraft began an uncommanded descent, its angle increasing before the pilots could identify the cause or engage full corrective measures. The autopilot continued its programmed course, yet the plane's response grew inconsistent. Instruments now conflicted in subtle but persistent ways. The first officer called out readings in short, clipped phrases, while the captain attempted manual corrections that the aircraft only partially followed. The descent was not violent at first, but increasingly rapid, a motion that violated expectation yet lacked a clear mechanical trigger. Within moments, the calm of cruise flight had transformed into a quiet, escalating crisis, one that passengers could not yet perceive. Short, clipped exchanges filled the cockpit as the crew attempted to reconcile the conflicting data, each word punctuated by uncertainty and urgency. "Altitude stable?" asked the first officer. "Adjusting," came the captain's reply, voice measured but tense. Each correction led to new inconsistencies, a pattern that neither training nor instinct could immediately resolve. The autopilot's attempts to maintain level flight lagged behind human inputs, creating a dissonance between expected and actual aircraft behaviour. These fractured dialogues, sparse yet urgent, revealed the cognitive load and growing pressure that would define the final moments of the flight. Autopilot outputs and instrument readings contradicted one another, forcing repeated manual adjustments while the plane's descent continued to steepen unpredictably. Every attempted correction seemed to provoke a new anomaly. Heading swings, sudden drops in altitude, and erratic vertical speed fluctuations compounded the pilot's frustration. Checks of rudder, aileron, and elevator responses revealed no mechanical faults, intensifying the mystery. The aircraft's increasing angle of descent, combined with contradictory instrument feedback, placed extraordinary demands on the crew, whose calm professionalism belied the rising tension. Each second brought an acceleration of events, an inexorable pull toward an outcome that would remain unexplained. Movement rippled through the cabin as passengers shifted and service carts swayed, reflecting the acceleration of a descent that appeared to defy explanation. Some looked to windows, noticing clouds moving unusually fast past the fuselage. Others simply tensed instinctively. The hum of the engines became background to subtle pressure changes and shifting vibrations, perceptible but not overtly alarming. The cabin itself seemed to respond to forces the passengers could feel but not understand, mirroring the crew's growing struggle to maintain control in a cockpit increasingly dominated by conflicting instrument feedback. Every adjustment from the crew was met with unanticipated feedback, instruments providing inconsistent information, and the aircraft responding in ways that challenged expectations and training. The captain attempted coordinated inputs to counter the descent, but vertical speed indicators and artificial horizons refused to align predictably. Systems checks were repeated, emergency procedures rehearsed in fragments, yet the aircraft's behaviour remained elusive. Even the most practiced manoeuvres were rendered uncertain, as if the plane's very systems had become unmoored from familiar physics. The cockpit became a stage for a struggle, both mechanical and cognitive, each correction met with yet another inexplicable reaction. Final cockpit transmissions were brief and fragmented, ending as the plane plunged rapidly, leaving behind the silence of a flight abruptly severed from communication. No distress call was completed, no alarm was effectively communicated externally, and the world outside remained unaware of the sudden calamity unfolding in the sky. Autopilot disengagement, instrument conflict, an escalating descent coalesced into a final sequence too rapid for recovery. The cockpit voice recorder captured the last human attempts to stabilize an aircraft that had, for reasons still undetermined, begun a fatal trajectory. In mere moments, the routine had dissolved into chaos, leaving only incomplete evidence of events. Flight recorders later confirmed that no mechanical failure fully accounted for the descent, underscoring the profound and unresolved mystery of the aircraft's final minutes. Investigators reviewed cockpit data, communication logs, and passenger reports, yet the source of the rapid, uncommanded descent remained undetermined. The abrupt nature of the event, combined with the lack of preceding warning signs or overt technical malfunction, made SilkAir 185 a perplexing case in aviation history. Every fact pointed to normalcy, routine procedure, and fully functioning systems, yet the outcome was undeniably catastrophic and inexplicably sudden. Into the skies above Indonesia, the plane slipped from view, leaving only the lingering enigma of how a routine flight became a sudden, untraceable descent.